Hey guys. This is God Harry. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part what if Harry Potter awakened ancient magic through his godfather's bond. Here is short summary. When a magical bond with Sirius breaks through Azkaban's darkness, young Harry awakens ancient powers that could change everything. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Harry shifted nervously from foot to foot under the scrutiny of the wand maker. The interior of the shop was gloomy, and there was a hint of oppressive magic mingling in the mustiness of the air. Harry didn't know what to say as the man continued to regard him, silvery eyes glinting through the dimness before the weathered face finally cracked into a smile. "Welcome, Mr. Potter," he said quietly. "I wasn't expecting you for another few months, but still, it seems only yesterday your parents were here, buying their first wands. Mahogany, 11 inches and willow 10 and a quarter, good for transfiguration and charms respectively," Harry murmured before the wand maker could. He had heard so much about his parents' wands that the words had just sort of come out, and at Mr. Ollivander's suddenly piercing stare he shrunk back against Padfoot. "Quite right," the man murmured to himself, "although I am surprised you would know such a thing." The last statement was directed at Harry, accompanied with a raised eyebrow, and the child shuffled a bit on the wooden floor. "I like listening to stories about them, sir. I've heard them so often I remember the details." Ollivander threw a sharp look in Harry's direction. "You are a most unusual child, Mr. Potter. Not many would remember details like that, and I have to admit that you are the first person I have seen with a grim as a familiar, although it does make sense considering your history. It will be a joy finding you a wand." As he was speaking, his eyes had drifted down to Padfoot, examining the dog, his eyes tracing the path of the bond, invisible to only a few eyes, when suddenly he beeped in a sharp breath. "Weird sworn." The words fell into a silence as instantly both Harry and Sirius froze, although Mr. Ollivander carried on, still in a shocked whisper. "I never thought to see one outside my books. I suppose that is why I mistook it for a familiar bond at first, that and they must be in their animagus form." While Ollivander had been rambling, Harry had pressed as close as possible to Sirius, shrinking behind him and backing away into a corner as Padfoot moved in front of his child protectively, muscles bunching, ready to leap at the first hint of a threat. Ollivander seemed to realize that he had lost his audience, and he glanced up, disorientated to see Harry clinging to Padfoot's fur, fear unmistakable in his eyes. Quickly he hurried to reassure the child. "Don't be frightened, Mr. Potter," he said quietly. "Unlike those fools at the ministry, I know that the bond will not harm you. In fact, there are few things that can give you more protection than that bond affords you." Harry regarded the old man dubiously. He didn't seem like he wanted to hurt them or hand his paw over to the ministry, but he was far too aware of what the consequences of discovery would be to be wary. "You won't tell anyone in the ministry?" he asked suspiciously, still clutching onto Padfoot's fur, muscles poised and ready bolt at the first sign of danger. At those words Ollivander let out a snort, taking both Harry and Sirius by surprise. "As if I'd tell those incompetent fools anything. Every year those dratted unspeakables come knocking, trying to get at information they've no right to and demanding that I tell them or they'll make the magic I use illegal." A somewhat sly grin crossed his face, although they never seemed to realize that irritating a wand maker is a bad idea, especially the one that makes their wands. They never seem to be quite so cocky once every wand in the shop starts firing stunners. Harry let out a small giggle, and he felt his paw amusement over the bond. It was quite fun imagining the people who had thrown his paw in jail and forced him to hide, running away from an old man with all the wands in the shop flying after them and pelting them with stunners. The old man smiled at the child. "I have to say it amuses me also, but I presume you will want a vow." He posed it as a question, looking straight at Sirius as he did so. The Grim nodded instantly. Now Ollivander knew he was an animagus. There was no point pretending that he couldn't understand what was going on, or that he was a real familiar. Inside he was pleased that the man had made the offer. He certainly wasn't going to let the old man walk away without taking a vow or being obliviated. However, that would have required him to switch forms, and this way limited the chance of further exposure, although "I will need you to transform or to reveal your identity, because otherwise there will be a weak link in the vow." A string of expletives formed quickly in his mind, but before one could find its way onto his tongue, Harry was standing in front of him, determination shining in his emerald eyes. "I won't let you," he cried. "You can't make Pa transform. The ministry will come and take him and you won't make me lose him." Sirius could feel the fear and sadness pouring off his child in waves, and he was moving before he was even consciously aware of it. He pushed gently against Harry's side in a silent gesture of support and nuzzled the child with his muzzle. Sirius felt Harry's determination give out a split second before the child collapsed against him, burrowing into his fur and clinging on with all his might, and the stench of fear thick upon the air. He allowed himself a single growl at the wandmaker before he turned his full attention back to his child, nuzzling at the boy's face and sending as much love over the bond as he was able. Slowly he felt Harry relax a little, although his nerves were still jangling, and he knew the boy was ready to either fight or run if it became necessary. But even as he reassured his child, he realized it was unlikely that they would get out of the shop without Ollivander knowing his identity. It was a difficult situation. Harry needed the wand and they needed the knowledge of the bond to remain between as few people as possible, and he realized that as Ollivander had the knowledge to recognize the bond, he might be able to tell them more about it, and he knew he could do with the information, as all the information he had been gained through trial and error. While he had been reassuring his child, Ollivander had been regarding the pair, a shrewd calculation in his eyes. The reaction particularly from the child provided him with several compelling hints. Firstly, they were not hiding out of choice but rather out of necessity, as whoever was Harry's guardian was wanted by the ministry, and as such had probably taken the child without ministry approval, but taken the child from a bad situation if their defensiveness was anything to go by. Secondly, whoever it was would have to have been known and trusted by the Potters as the ritual required a parent. He pulled the facts together in his mind, and one name was screaming out at him, but his instincts were telling him it couldn't be true. Sirius Black was wanted by the ministry. He was still at large 4 years after breaking out of Azkaban, and nobody had seen any trace of him, and he certainly would have been trusted by the Potters. He was the boys' godfather and had been their secret keeper. And there was the sticking point. If it was Black, then he could not have betrayed them. The bond would not have allowed it, and neither would the bond have taken him if he had already done so. So either he was not the secret keeper and he had been innocent, or he was wrong and it was someone else entirely. Coming to a decision, he waved his wand, causing the shutters to fly down and the sign in the window to switch to closed. Harry glanced up at the sudden movement, instantly coming onto the defensive as he realized they were trapped. Seeing the fear and threat in the child's eyes, Ollivander raised his hands. "I intend no harm to either of you. I just thought you would not want anyone to see your identity, particularly if you are wanted by the ministry." Something in the dog's eyes flickered, and as Ollivander watched, the dog retreated into the shadows. He didn't see the dog rear up and become a man, but he did hear the frightened cry as the boy launched himself into the darkness. Harry had seen Padfoot retreat and he knew what his pa was about to do, but he wasn't going to let him. He wasn't going to lose his father, and he wasn't ever going back to his aunt and uncle. He flung himself after his pa, only to run straight into his father's chest. Instantly Sirius's arms wrapped around him, tugging him straight into an embrace, but for once Harry resisted the comfort. "Change back, pa," he begged, struggling against the arms that held him as his voice cracked. "Please just change back, please." "Shush, Harry. It's all right, puppy," Sirius murmured, tightening his grip on the struggling child and cuddling him close. He knew what he was doing was risky, but he hadn't received any sort of warning, and he knew that the fact Ollivander knew about the bond meant that he would hear him out at least. But his words seemed to have no effect on the child, who was managing to work himself into a panic. A quick glance up revealed that Ollivander hadn't come any closer, and he seemed to be waiting for Harry to regain his composure. Not having to worry about that, Sirius turned his full attention to his son, holding Harry as close as he could, murmuring soothing words and gently stroking the child's back whilst pouring as much love across the bond as he was able. Even then Harry was not calming down, and it tore at Sirius's heart to know that this was something he had caused, no matter how inadvertently. Harry didn't know what to do. His pa wasn't changing back, and every moment he stayed human increased the chances that he would be discovered. He couldn't lose his pa. He couldn't. Pa was the only family he had, the only person that loved him, and if he was taken away he wouldn't have anything. Why couldn't Pa see that it wasn't safe, that he would be taken? His struggles gave way into sobs as the full impact of what would happen hit him, and he wished with all his heart that they had just stayed in France and that he didn't have to go to Hogwarts because then his pa wouldn't be in danger. Sirius felt the precise moment when Harry slumped down in his arms, his face buried in his shoulder and the small frame shaking with sobs. Tenderly Sirius cradled his child, constantly murmuring reassurances. Slowly the sobs gave way into hiccups, but Sirius could still feel the fear that pulsed through his son. He pressed a key onto his child's forehead, whispering his apology before slowly standing. Harry balanced carefully in his arms as the child clung tightly to his father, and stepping out of the shadows to face the wand maker. To his credit, Ollivander didn't let the shock he must have been feeling show on his face. He blinked slowly, taking in the sight of the wizarding world's most wanted criminal standing with his arms wrapped protectively around the boy everyone swore he longed to kill, a boy whose face was buried in Black's shoulder and who was clinging desperately to the man. He could see the bond glowing between them, gold and thick, and he wondered how he had ever mistook it for a familiar bond. It was so clearly a weird bond, and although it was the first he had seen such a bond, he could tell it was strong. There were several beats of silence as they stared at one another. Then, "You were not the secret keeper." Ollivander spoke levelly. "You did not betray the Potters to Voldemort, and I am guessing that there is a lot more to the confrontation with Pettigrew than meets the eye." Sirius nodded instantly. "We switched at the last minute. Pettigrew was the traitor. He betrayed James and Lily, and when I confronted him, he cut off his finger, blew up the street, and framed me for his crimes." The grief in his voice as he spoke and the tenderness with which he held the Potter boy were enough to fully convince the man of Sirius's story. He knew that the man could not have betrayed the Potters when he was sworn to their son, and Sirius's story seemed to be the only logical reason as to why he would have gone after Pettigrew. But Ollivander could understand their caution and the boy's fear. He knew the Ministry would not listen and that they would have Black thrown back into Azkaban or given the key the instant they caught him. And with that thought, "I swear on my life and magic I will not reveal the identity of Sirius Black or his animagus form, or the information of the bonding between Sirius Black and Harry Potter without their permission." A flash of light sealed the bond, and he caught the grateful look Black sent him before he turned back to his godson. "See, puppy," he murmured, "Mr. Ollivander won't tell anyone, and I'm safe here." Bright emerald green eyes snapped up, and Ollivander had the uncomfortable feeling that those eyes were seeing straight into his heart. The moment was broken when the child looked away, appearing satisfied, and slipped out of his godfather's arms, although Ollivander noticed that he kept a tight grip on the man's hand. Ollivander shook himself and flicked his wand, and his tape measure shot out, measuring the boy as he flitted around the shelves, selecting boxes. "I assume you two could do with a wand, Mr. Black." "They must have snapped your original." "I would be grateful," Sirius replied. "And also, you seem to know a lot about the bond, and I'm afraid I know very little. Only what I have discovered during the last few years and what Lily and James knew at the start. And I was wondering whether there was anything you could tell us about it." Ollivander considered the request carefully before nodding. "I would not normally give out such knowledge, but there can't be a more suitable circumstance than this. But first, your wands." He pressed the first specimen into Harry's hand with the terse instruction to give it a wave. Feeling somewhat foolish, Harry did so, but the wand was snatched away almost immediately and another put in its place. As the pile of discarded wands grew higher, Ollivander was almost flitting about the shelves, so great was his excitement. "I haven't had so tricky a customer in nearly 50 years, he explained as he took back the 37th wand. "Most find their wand within the first 10 they try, but you, Mr. Potter, seem to be extraordinary, and I don't doubt your godfather will be the same." He looked almost gleeful at the prospect. The pile of discarded wands was teetering precariously on the spindly chair when Mr. Ollivander emerged from the depths of the store, a dusty box held almost reverently in his hand. Carefully he presented the wand, and as Harry took it he felt a slight warmth in his fingers and a few sparks shot out of the end, although there was a strange feeling, almost as if it wasn't quite right, that there was something missing. "You are certainly unique, Mr. Potter," Ollivander murmured as he reclaimed the wand. "It seems that this is your match, however it requires a secondary core to be a complete match." Holly and Phoenix Feather, 11.5 inches, certainly curious. "I will need you to come and choose a secondary core, but first let's see if your godfather will be as hard to match." Again the pile of wands mounted higher, and Ollivander appeared to be almost skipping as he presented wand after wand for Sirius to try. Haven't had two such difficult customers for years, he said a little giddily. I has been a absolute pleasure, and I still have the choosing of a secondary core, and potentially a wood as well to complete. It was the 46th wand Sirius tried when he finally got a reaction. Ebony and phoenix feather. 11 inches, the old wandmaker murmured, and this too needs adjustment, although in your case I fancy it needs a secondary wood rather than core. With a sharp head gesture he led them into the rear of the shop, opening a barely visible door to lead them down into his workshop. Mr. Black first, he said quietly. A new wood will take longest to bond with the existing wand. He hurried to the large cabinets that rose up on each side of the small room and quickly extracted nearly 24 different branches. Hold your hand over each, with the wand in your other hand, and see which calls for you, he instructed, an edge of excitement in his voice. It was the 6th wand he tried when suddenly Sirius felt a pulse of warmth shoot up his fingers. Reaching out he grabbed the branch before presenting it Ollivander. The old man's eyebrows rose. Blackthorn normally does not work until you have suffered with it, however this piece seems to have already recognized this in you. It will make a fine wand. The wandmaker took the wand, holding both it and the piece of blackthorn loosely in spindly fingers, turning them over and over as he examined them, muttering to himself in places, tracing a pattern here and there with his fingers on the polished wood. Eventually he seemed satisfied and he gave them a tense command to stand back. Sirius complied instantly, positioning himself so that Harry stood behind him, ensuring that the child would be protected from whatever piece of magic Ollivander was about to perform. He felt small fingers lock into the back of his shirt and he knew that Harry was frightened for him. He reached back and gave the boy's hand a gentle squeeze and he felt Harry's grip ease, although he noticed that the child never actually let go. Ollivander was standing in the center of the room, holding the wand and the new branch in a single hand. Quietly at first he began to chant, old words, unfamiliar but a lyrical sound Sirius had heard once before. Ollivander was speaking in the old tongue, the language used in any old magic ritual. He felt a thrill rush through him as the sound swelled to a crescendo and a shining light built, enveloping the wand, eventually becoming so bright that he was forced to look away, shielding his eyes. When the light faded, a wand sat in Ollivander's palm, two woods intertwined throughout its length, but harsh divisions marred the wood where they joined. However, Ollivander did not seem fazed. Rather, he nodded in satisfaction and placed the wand in a stone blow engraved with a myriad of runes before covering it with a cloth that thrummed with magic. It will take a couple of hours for the woods to reconcile, he informed them, and whilst we are waiting I shall endeavor to craft Mr. Potter's wand. He moved over to a second cabinet, slim fingers darting through the many drawers and extracting a wide variety of materials. I will not use any of these except for secondary cores, he informed them. I find as the single base they are far too temperamental, however when paired with another main core they can produce spectacular results. Mr. Potter, if you will. A little gingerly Harry stepped forward, holding his hand over the cores just as he had seen Sirius do. He could feel a slight tingling in his palm and he moved in the direction it indicated, his hand eventually coming to rest over a long black feather. Cautiously he picked it up, feeling a thrill of warmth flood up his fingers. Turning, he presented it to the wandmaker, who took the materials almost reverently. A thunderbird feather, he breathed, paired with a phoenix core. You will be able to do powerful magic with this wand. Yes, I expect great things from you. Once again he gave the terse command for them to stand back, and again Sirius pulled Harry behind him, protecting the child with his body. He felt Harry peek round to try and watch the ritual and he didn't blame the child. He would probably never get another chance to see a wand being crafted, however he remained alert, ready to cover the boy's eyes or pull his son behind him if it looked like things were getting dangerous. A low chant started up, this one markedly different from the one that he had sung to join the woods. Before their eyes the shape of runes rose from the wood, burnished red and glowing. The chant was more melodic, less harsh than the one sung over Sirius's wand, and as they watched they saw a hairline crack slip up the body of the wood, and it was into this tiny space Ollivander carefully inserted the second feather. Instantly the chanting changed, becoming harsher and more guttural. Power was thick on the air and there was the lingering sound of a phoenix cry and a clap of thunder which resonated with the magic. The runes began to glow, shining brighter and brighter, and slowly they began to move until they were dancing over the surface of the wood in a dazzling reel that spun too fast for the eye to follow. There was a sudden cry and the magic died as the runes faded back into the wood. Blinking, Sirius passed his hand over his eyes to try and remove the afterimage of the runes from his retinas, and beside him he could see Harry doing the same thing. Ollivander waited impatiently for a few minutes as their vision returned to normal before he handed the finished wand to Harry, an eager expression on his face. As Harry's hand made contact with the wand, he knew immediately that it was right. There was no trace of the incompleteness which had marred it initially, and a large pulse of warmth shot up his arm even as a multitude of sparks erupted from the end, gold, red, silver, bronze and blue, spinning away into the darkness of the shop. Mr. Ollivander clapped his hands in delight and his paw was smiling down at him, pride obvious in his gray eyes. "Well done, puppy," he said, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze, and Harry grinned up at him, his own pleasure and delight shining in his eyes and rushing along the bond. After a few moments Ollivander cleared his throat. "It will take another hour and a half at least for the woods to reconcile," he said once he had got their attention, "so now would be the ideal time to explain the old magic to you." "I'm immensely grateful," Sirius told the old wandmaker as he bustled around trying to find chairs, eventually managing to locate two and levitate them over towards where they were standing. "Whatever you could tell us would be hugely useful. It's a privilege to share that knowledge with you. I have certainly been blessed to see such a bond in my lifetime," Ollivander informed them as he settled down on one of the chairs. Sirius followed suit, and Harry, quickly deciding that he didn't really fancy either standing or sitting on the dusty floor, clambered up onto Sirius's lap and instantly felt his paw arms wrap around him. He wasn't as embarrassed by this as other children might have been. It might have been partially to do with the bond, and partially to do with the fact that his paw had been the first person he could remember who had loved him and cared for him, and maybe even the fact that even in France he had had few adults in his life apart from his paw, but he was extremely close to him. He knew precisely how much his paw loved him. He could feel it every single day, and he knew it was the best feeling in the world. It was very difficult to be embarrassed when he could feel all the love paw had for him. He suddenly realized that while he had been thinking, Pa had been talking to Mr. Ollivander, and he tuned back into the conversation just in time to hear him say, "The only thing we've really discovered is the ability to project emotions across the bond both ways, not just sense them, and there's a strange sort of sense I get when things might be dangerous, which I think is the bond. Oh, and of course the ability to track and locate Harry no matter where he is or what wards he is under." Ollivander nodded, looking very thoughtful. "You know more than I had expected, but then again you have lived with it for several years." He leant back on his hard chair, steepling his fingers together. "However, from the summary you have given me, it appears that you are lacking knowledge in several key areas." He paused, a strange expression crossing his face, and Sirius suddenly felt that the knowledge that they did not have would be best left unknown, but there was nothing he could do as Ollivander gathered his thoughts together and started to speak. "I suppose I should first start with the disadvantages. Normally the emotion bond was regarded as a disadvantage, as many of these bonds would be used to protect important figures in society, princes and the like, and it was seen as unsuitable. However, obviously that is not something that you see as a disadvantage. Indeed," he said with a slight tilt of his head in their direction, "you seem to have discovered a large amount of hitherto unknown information on the emotion bond, purely because you utilize it and see it as a benefit rather than an unfortunate side effect." There was another pause, and Sirius felt worry rise in him as he saw that the old wandmaker's face was guarded with no hint of emotion slipping through. "The second main side effect and disadvantage," he said slowly, "is the fact such a bonding is for life, and the weird will not only live as long as the person they are sworn to, unless they die to protect them, they also cannot survive beyond the death of the one they are sworn to." The words dropped into a sudden silence. A flash of shock crossed Sirius's features before he composed himself. He should have known such a ritual would have a price, that was the reason that most of the rituals that came under the old magics had been banned and could only now be found in illicit texts or in the depths of old family libraries such as the Maine Potter and Black collections. But the price was something he would be willing to pay. He knew he would never want to outlive his child, and it gave him the chance to be with Harry for the rest of his life and the ability to experience that along with him. However, while he was accepting, Perhaps even slightly welcoming of this development. He knew that his child would not be, and he could feel Harry's shock, and he knew once the news broke through that barrier Harry would need him desperately. And with that thought, he tightened his arms, pulling the child against his chest and holding him there securely, one hand already rubbing up and down the boy's spine, comforting and soothing. Cannot survive beyond the death of the one they are sworn to. The words beat round Harry's head, the only thought in his mind. When he died, Pa would die too. He was going to kill his Pa, and it would be all his fault. Pa had loved him, protected him, looked after him, done everything a little boy could wish for, and he was repaying that by killing him. He felt tears well up. Why did he have to be the one to kill Pa? He loved his Pa and he never wanted to hurt him, but now he knew he would, and there was nothing he could do about it. The first sob tore itself from his throat. He was horrible. He had to be. Only someone truly horrible would be responsible for killing their father. Then another thought burst into his consciousness. Pa must hate him now. The thought caused his tears to fall faster, streaking down his cheeks. He wouldn't blame Pa if he hated him now, but the thought hurt, and the knowledge that if he did, he would be able to feel that hate every day. Suddenly he became aware of the fact that he was still sitting on his Pa lap, Pa arms wrapped tightly around him. A rush of shame heated his cheeks. He didn't deserve his Pa, not if he was going to kill him, didn't deserve his comfort. With that thought in mind, he began to struggle, trying to get away so he could run and hide, to make sure he didn't hurt Pa anymore. The arms holding him tightened further, and he was pulled deeper into the embrace even as he struggled, trying to get free. A gentle hand rubbed his spine, and even in the midst of his struggles he felt himself being buried in his Pa love as he was snuggled even closer. It was the shock of feeling the overwhelming love surround him that stopped his struggles. He'd been sure his Pa hated him now, but all he could feel was the love Sirius was pouring out to him, tinted with concern at the edges. Cautiously he glanced up. He couldn't understand why Pa didn't hate him now, but his godfather's face was filled with nothing but love and concern for him. He went limp in Sirius's arms, sobs still forcing themselves steadily out of his throat as he stared up at his Pa. Between one sob and the next he managed to croak out, "Pa, I'm sorry." Almost instantly he felt a key being pressed to his head. "No, Harry," Sirius murmured, his voice filled with a wealth of tenderness, "there's nothing to be sorry for. But I'm going to kill you and it'll be my fault," the child sobbed out. "No, puppy, no," Sirius whispered vehemently, gentle fingers stroking the boy's messy hair. "That's not your fault. It's never going to be your fault." He rocked the child back and forth, cradling him as he had when Harry had been younger. He had some idea of the thoughts that must be going through his child's mind. How many times had he felt guilty about the deaths of his best friends, even though he had not been the one to cast the curse himself, and he knew it must be worse for Harry, when he thought it would be his actions that killed him and it would be directly his fault. He pressed another key to his son's forehead, cocooning the boy in warmth and love. "Harry, I chose the bond and I have never and will never regret that decision," he told him softly. Harry looked up, the confusion and pain marring his eyes, sending a lance into his heart. "But it's going to kill you." Impossibly Sirius managed to snuggle the child closer. "No, little one," he murmured, his voice gentle, "it's going to let me live. It will let me stay with you for your entire life, let me see you grow up and have children and grandchildren of your own, and I won't miss any of it." He saw that his son was hanging on his every word, and he continued to speak, voice low and soothing, "And yes, it's true that when you die I will also die too, but Harry, that is a blessing. No parent should ever have to bury their child, and if you died I would have nothing left. To let me die when you do is a blessing. I will never have to lose you again." Wide eyes stared up at him, drinking in his sincerity, and very slowly he saw Harry nod. Sirius knew that the child didn't understand, and he was thankful that he couldn't and that he wouldn't for years yet, but the fact that Harry accepted that it was not his fault was all he wanted. Relief seeped through him, tendrils slinking across the bond to his son as he loosened his grip slightly, reassured the child was not about to run. Harry directed up a shy smile in his direction, and Sirius smiled reassuringly down at him, some of the pain leaving his heart as his godson relaxed against his chest. Ollivander had busied himself with something else while Sirius's had been reassuring his child, realizing that this was something Godfather and Godson needed to deal with privately. but feeling Sirius's eyes upon him, he turned back and resumed his seat. I'm sorry I had to be the one to tell you that, but it was not something it would have been fair to hide. Sirius just nodded his acceptance of the apology, and Ollivander continued. That is the last of the disadvantages. Now there are several main abilities the bond confers to you, namely the ability to track Harry and find him no matter what wards he is under, and the ability to sense future danger to Harry, usually described as a feeling of unease or a warning in your brain connected with a specific event or decision. Those are the two new abilities and the main attributes of the bond, but there are many other side effects that aid you in protecting him. He paused, mentally pulling up a list of the attributes before he continued. You will be able to force Harry to transform into a secondary animagus form, namely a copy of your own. When Harry is in serious danger, you can be pulled magically to him. The bond will increase the rate at which you both heal, and you can force your magic to heal him faster even with what would otherwise be fatal wounds. And lastly, although this has not been confirmed, there are rumors that the strongest or oldest bonds could confer a slight telepathic connection, based off the emotion bond, although such connections were extremely weak at best, not going much beyond shared dreams and a better sense of what the other needs or what their words mean. Sirius had been listening attentively, nodding as some of what he suspected had been confirmed. It would greatly help them to have this knowledge, and the fact that he now knew precisely what the bond could do would mean that they would both be less likely to be caught by surprise, and they would be able to use the abilities now they knew they had them. Thank you, he said sincerely, and Ollivander inclined his head in response. It has been my pleasure, and you are welcome to come and visit me at any time. But now I believe your wand is about ready, and I'm sure I have delayed you enough already. With a smile in their direction, he stood and strode over to the table and uncovered the wand, nodding in satisfaction as he examined it. Spindly fingers plucked it out of the stone basin and presented it to Sirius. The instant his fingers touched the wand, he felt warmth shoot up his arm, and he knew instantly that this was the right wand for him. Idly his mind noted that the two woods were no longer marred but flowed smoothly into one another. Seized by a sudden urge to see what this wand was capable of, he murmured an incantation under his breath, and he felt the wand respond instantly, magic slipping seamlessly through it. A delighted smile graced his features. After so many years without a wand and using an ill match, he had forgotten the ease with which a bonded wand could cast. Still smiling, he paid the man, giving him the gold even when he refused it. You've done something nobody else could have done, he told the wandmaker firmly. Not only did make wands for us and gave us information about the bond, you heard me out. Allow me then to pay for the things you actually charge for. Despite further protests, Sirius eventually managed to pay the man 30 galleons for the 2 wands and a pair of wand holsters. Years of arguing with Remus, perhaps the most stubborn man on the planet when it came to things relating to his furry problem, paying dividends. Once that was settled, he turned to his godson, ruffling the child's hair affectionately. We need to head back to the alley I apparated us to, puppy, and then we can head home. Do you remember what the activation for the portkey is? At Harry's nod, he smiled at the boy before transforming back into his animagus form and pressing close to his child, even as the boy's fingers twined into his fur. There was nothing else that they needed to do in the alley until it was time to purchase Harry's school supplies. Anything that Potter Manor didn't have they could order via owls, and he knew that Harry was frightened enough without adding to that fear. Gently he nudged the door open with his nose, and he padded out into the street and back to the leaky cauldron. Nobody paid them any notice as they passed through the crowded pub and onto the streets of Muggle London. Once they were safely back in the alley, Sirius transformed and took hold of Harry's hand. He felt Harry grab his and hold on tightly even as they murmured the activation words, and felt the hook behind the navel as they were pulled off to the first place Sirius had really called home. Dumbledore paced his office thoughtfully. The Hogwarts letters for the next group of first years were beginning to be written, a year group that should include Harry Potter. It had been 4 years since the child had disappeared from Privet Drive and Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban, and since then there had been no sightings of either of them, and the only reason that he had not given up hope was the fact that on the Hogwarts list Harry Potter's name was still clearly written. If the child had died, it would have been removed, and it was still there, which meant Harry was alive somewhere, and while the child was alive there was still hope. But every day Harry remained in Black's care, the hope became slimmer. There was no knowing what the madman was teaching the boy. Would Harry come to Hogwarts convinced he must join Voldemort? Dumbledore shuddered at the possibility. Of course, there was hope that the man had seen the error of his support for the man and was raising Harry properly, but after the kidnapping, it was a slim hope indeed. Not to mention, the search was becoming increasingly disheartening. A few months ago, they had done another sweep of the Black properties, the first one they had done since the initial check after the escape. There had been nothing upon nothing upon nothing. It seemed that Black had been steering clear of his old properties, and Dumbledore knew why. The man was clever, and the Black properties would have been the obvious places to hide, so that would have been the first place they would have checked, and Black would not have gone to all the effort to escape and hide only to be caught so easily. Of course, they couldn't discount the possibility he was living in a Black property that was under the Fidelis, and as such they had never checked it, but everyone seemed to think they had checked everywhere, and there were no obvious memory gaps that would have been associated with a Fidelis. There had been one place where they thought they were going to find Black, the place Alistair and his team had visited that afternoon. There was evidence on the Black Chateau in France that the wards had been raised and lowered recently enough that Alistair had asked him to come out and take a look. It had certainly looked promising. Dumbledore had caught the traces of the wards. They were reasonably slight, indicating that Black hadn't stayed long, but the real information had come from questioning the house elves. Moody had noticed one was missing, a younger one that had been there when they had visited previously. The elves had told them that she was working on another estate, but Dumbledore had guessed that she was actually with Black. It would make sense, as a house elf would be invaluable, particularly as they could move throughout the wizarding world undetected and they could purchase supplies without any risk. Dumbledore was all but certain the goblins had provided him with access to the Black fortune. They cared little for wizarding laws, and the lack of a trial would mean they wouldn't even view him as a convict. He pulled his mind away from that train of thought. It didn't matter how and where Black got supplies, as they couldn't counter it. What mattered was the information the house elves had unknowingly given them. They had insisted that Black had never been there, and they hadn't bothered to use Veritasium. It wouldn't work if the elves had orders not to reveal information, orders which Black had almost certainly given them. But it was the wording that had tipped them off. They had repeatedly said, "Master Sirius and the young master have never been here." It was the words "young master" that had given the game away. Harry had been there, and it was evident that to the elves' minds at least he was their master also. That thought both frightened and comforted him. Comforted him in the fact he knew Harry was alive and that he was not being mistreated or tortured. He knew what love was, but also frightened him as the fact Sirius was treating him well indicated that he got on well with the child, which meant that the boy was almost certainly corrupted towards the dark. But the pieces didn't quite add up. He hadn't realized it when he had originally spoken to the elves. He had been distracted by the confirmation that Harry was alive and seemed to be well cared for, but thinking about it, there were a few things that had taken him by surprise. The way that elves had spoken about Black, calling him Master Sirius, a level of familiarity that was unheard of in pureblood circles, and it indicated that Black did not regard them as lower beings. It was an attitude that he would not have expected among Voldemort's right-hand man, as the Dark Lord was known for his contempt of those he regarded as being beneath him, a place house elves occupied. With a sigh, Albus Dumbledore sank down into his chair. They could only keep searching, but he had the sinking suspicion that neither Black nor Harry would be found unless Black wanted them found, and that there was nothing he could do until Harry came to Hogwarts. If he came to Hogwarts, and only then, they could try to minimize the damage Black had to have caused. But if Harry had been cared for and loved by his godfather, Dumbledore knew he had a daunting challenge indeed, if it was even possible. Harry's eyes grew almost impossibly wide as he took in the building before him. Having spent most of his life in small towns, in both France and England, the house before his was a shock, not in the least as he realized it was his, not his pa but actually his. It was almost a classic fortified manor. It didn't have the size or opulent nature of the Black Chateau, but to Harry's eyes it was magnificent. A moat circled the building, fed by a small river that leapt and bubbled along. The house itself was built of a mixture of stone and timber, rising up only 2 stories but with 4 wings surrounding a courtyard and a tower overlooking the whole manor. On the far side of the river, Harry caught sight of a cluster of buildings, many of which looked domestic in nature. His paw reached down and helped him up off the ground, where the portkey had deposited them. Harry had been so busy staring that he had forgotten that he was lying in a heap on the ground. He blushed as he felt traces of his paw amusement float across the bond even as Sirius brushed the dirt from his clothing. Harry continued to stare in wonder, but he was gradually becoming aware of a strange feel to his paw emotions, something that was a touch sad and almost wistful. He glanced up. "Pa?" he questioned softly. Sirius started before looking down to meet worried emerald eyes. "I'm fine, pup. This where your dad grew up, and I lived here too after I ran away. I hadn't been back since they died and it brought back some memories." He surveyed the manor once before he turned back to Harry, placing an arm over the boy's shoulders and forcibly pushing his nostalgia and sorrow. He pointed over at the cluster of buildings Harry had noticed before. "That is the farm. Potter Manor is almost entirely self-sufficient, mainly because of the farm. It extends for 100 acres and cattle, pigs, sheep and chickens are kept as well as growing grain and vegetables. I even believe there is a watermill and a dovecote somewhere. Usually the Potters hired a retainer to work the farm and supply the house with meat, grain and vegetables, but your grandparents and the retainer were killed shortly before your mum and dad went into hiding, so they never took on another one." He saw Harry nod seriously, a slight hint of sadness floating across the bond. Sirius spoke again, trying to cheer the child up. "And you can't see from here, but behind the house is a Quidditch pitch, and I think that would be exactly the right place to teach you how to fly." His distraction worked perfectly. Excitedly Harry looked up, his eyes shining as he looked at his godfather. "You'll teach me to fly, Pa?" Sirius chuckled. "Of course, puppy. James wouldn't forgive me if I didn't teach you. He was completely Quidditch mad, not to mention it's a skill every young wizard should have." Harry's eyes sparkled as they always did whenever Sirius told him about his parents. Even though he viewed Sirius as his father, that didn't stop his joy in hearing the stories about James and Lily and learning everything he could about them. "I'll teach you charms and spells as well," Sirius added, quickly bringing the child's attention back to him. "You are good at potions, you shouldn't have any problems with the first-year stuff." He smiled down at the child. "You seem to have inherited some of Lily's gift in the subject. James could brew potions adequately, but he was nowhere near a natural. It was only the fact that Lily tutored him throughout his 7th year that he got an E on his newt." Harry had heard this before, of course, but it didn't stop him grinning as he heard it again. After a moment, though, the grin fell as his gaze came back to the house, resting rather firmly on the moat, which had no drawbridge or bridge of any sort. Pa?" he asked quietly. "How do we get in?" "There isn't a drawbridge." To his surprise, his pa just laughed. "There is a drawbridge, puppy. It just won't appear until a Potter calls it." He paused, then hurried on, answering the unspoken question in Harry's eyes. "You need to stand opposite the door, placing your hand on the stone by the moat, and say, 'As heir to the house of Potter, I command that the manor open unto me.'" Harry nodded obediently and hurried to the outcrop of rock that Sirius had indicated. Placing his palm firmly down, he intoned the words his pa had told him, and to his surprise he saw a drawbridge materialize in front of him. At his paw nod, he stepped tentatively onto the planks and walked across the moat to their new home. Harry had only just stepped inside the house when he found himself flying backwards straight into Sirius as something tackled his legs. His paw caught him and steadied him, and it was only once he had regained his breath that Harry looked down to see what had collided with him, and he was immediately face to face with a sobbing house elf. "Young master has come back," the creature sobbed as it clung to his legs. Harry looked up at Sirius with an expression that could only mean help. He may have grown up around Kitsy, but the young elf had never tackled him in the same way this one had, not to mention he didn't know what to do when people started to cry, let alone a house elf. Chuckling kindly at his son's expression, Sirius leant down. "Hello, Mopsa." The change in the elf was startling. Instantly she looked up, her expression bordering between fear and wariness as she looked at Sirius. "Master Sirius has come back," she said suspiciously. "Master Sirius has come back with the young master, but they say Master Sirius betrayed Master James and Mistress Lily." Harry drew breath to defend his pa. He hated it that people blamed his pa for his parents' deaths. His pa was the nicest person in the world, and he would never be the murderer everyone thought he was. He had been the best pa he could have asked for, and even though he had never told pa this, knowing that he didn't want to take the place of Harry's first dad, he thought of his pa as his father, and there was no one else he would have accepted in that role. But before he could draw breath to tell the elf this, Sirius spoke. I know that's what they say about me, Mopsa, but I never betrayed James or Lily. You know James was my brother in all but blood, and I would have died before I betrayed them. The elf regarded him for a moment, her eyes drifting down to the empty air where they both knew the bond could be seen before she nodded. I believes you, Master Sirius, she said eventually. You couldn't have betrayed them, and you've brought the young master back here's. Sirius smiled at the elf, who, now she had decided that Sirius was not a threat, was almost bouncing with her excitement of finally having Harry and people back in the manor. Would you please prepare bedrooms for us? I think James's and mine would be suitable. He instructed her. The two bedrooms were next to one another along a corridor with a connecting door, and he knew Harry would prefer it if he was nearby. Kitsy, one of the Black family elves, has been caring for us when we had no access to the manor and will bring our baggage here shortly. I know the manor is large, and in the absence of a retainer it is more work than a single elf can manage to look after the house and the farm. You is giving me another elf to work with. There was definite hope in the elf's voice, and Sirius nodded. Kitsy has been a loyal elf for the past 4 years, and I believe that together you will be able to care for us and manage the farm. The little elf's eyes grew as wide as saucers as she nodded. We's can be doing that, Master Sirius. Sirius smiled and thanked her before turning back to Harry. We need to go the Wardstone pup. The main blood wards will be up, but there are other things you can activate now the manor is out of lockdown. Harry nodded immediately. He was going to do everything to make sure that he kept both him and his paw safe. He was never going to let anyone take paw away from him. He was not to lose the only person who loved him. Sirius led him down a small tunnel that led into the depths of the manor, and they were approaching the Wardstone when Harry remembered something Sirius had taught him about Wardstones, especially the family ones. Why do you know about this one, Pascal? He asked. I thought they were hidden from anyone not in the family. The tunnel was too narrow for him to see his paw expression, but he felt the flood of sadness which swept down the bond. Instantly Harry felt awful, and he wrapped his arms as well as he could around his paw, trying to comfort him the same way that Sirius had done for him so often. Somewhat awkwardly Sirius twisted round in the narrow space and sat down. Harry immediately climbed into his lap, snuggling up against him as he tried to convey how sorry he was, and tried to make him feel better. He felt his paw arms wrap around him even as he murmured, I'm sorry, paw. It's all right, puppy, Sirius murmured in reply, you weren't to know. The silence stretched for several moments, and Harry felt some of his paw sadness recede before Sirius spoke again. When I was 16 I ran away from home, he said quietly, and Harry stared up at him, emerald eyes wide with shock. His paw had never spoken much about his childhood. He had told him stories about his time at Hogwarts and the things he had got up to in the summers with James, and stories from after they had left Hogwarts, and Harry had never really asked. At first it hadn't occurred to him, and when he got a little older he had realized that Sirius got upset if he asked or only gave short answers, so he had stopped asking. He had been curious, but there were so many other stories and so many other interesting things to learn that he had put it from his mind and thought about other things. I came to the Potters, Sirius continued softly. They took me in as a second son and pretty much became my parents. Most of my family didn't want me, so your granddad decided to make me part of the Potter family too. It meant I am recognized as part of the Potter family too, and that I know about the family-only areas, but I could never be the head of house. Harry nodded but didn't make any attempt to move from his position in his paw arms. He knew that at the moment his paw needed him, and he was not going to let his paw down when he had been there for him so many times before. They remained there for several more moments before his paw pressed a key to his forehead before standing. We'd better get the wards up, puppy. I can tell you what to do, but I can't manipulate them myself. Harry nodded but made sure to stay close to his paw as they headed deeper down the narrow tunnel. Eventually they reached what appeared to be a dead end, and Harry looked up at Sirius in confusion. A hint of a grimace flashed across his paw features. This door is blood-locked, he said softly. It needs a little of your blood on it before it will open, and the ward stone will require the same. Harry made a face, but he stuck his hand out. He would do anything to make sure that they would stay safe, and he knew that his paw would be as gentle as possible, as the last thing he wanted was to hurt Harry. The protections, however, made that impossible. He saw the apology in his paw eyes and felt his pain across the bond as he gently prodded the end of Harry's finger with the point of a dagger, drawing a small well of blood. Harry couldn't stop the grimace, but he quickly wiped his finger across the stone, leaving a smear of blood behind. As soon as his finger was away, his paw caught his hand and healed it with a murmured incantation, and Harry smiled up at him. His godfather brushed a light key onto his head as the stone slowly started to pull open. Harry didn't know what he had expected, but the small, rough-hewn chamber decorated with a myriad of runes was not it. The room, if you could call it that, was dark, with the only light coming from a single gem set in the center of the room, and a handful of other gems that seemed to be set into the walls. They were all glowing softly and casting long shadows of the chamber walls, drawing the runes half in shadow. But it was the crystals themselves which drew his gaze. They were large, the smallest being the size of his fist whilst the largest nearly the size of a football. He thought they were gems, but he couldn't quite be sure. They were so large and they lacked the shine of a real gem, but what else could it be? No stone could glow like they did, and no stone would have the myriad of faces, each as smooth as a mirror and the edges razor sharp. Facets of the crystals glowed with magic, and he could feel the magic pulsing in this room, growing until it was almost oppressive within the stone walls. He knew without a doubt that this place was powerful, and he didn't know how, but he knew that the power was coming from somewhere, and it was that well of power that had kept his family safe through time, and it was that power that was going to keep him and his paw safe once again. You need to smear a little of your blood on the central crystal, his paw instructed softly, then place your hand on the crystal, the magic in it will guide you to what you need to do. His voice was quiet, an instinctual response to the power and magic that vibrated from the stones, suffusing the chamber's very walls. Harry bit his lip as he held out his hand once more, and he felt his paw rub his shoulder comfortingly before carefully and as gently as he could, he nicked Harry's finger just deep enough to cause beads of blood to seep out. Quickly Harry placed his bloody fingertip on a cool facet of the central stone, and a colored stain spread through the stone. He cast a frantic glance back at his paw, although he didn't remove his hand. "It's what it's supposed to do, puppy," his paw told him quietly, and he might have started to say something else, but at that moment the crystal suddenly flared, the magic bursting outwards, and immediately Harry's attention was pulled down to the crystal. He didn't know how, but suddenly all the knowledge of how to manipulate the wards was there. All it needed was his command. Between one breath and the next he ordered the wards up on maximum strength possible when the house was on lockdown. Only humans which were personally keyed by blood into the wards by Harry or had Potter blood in their veins and meant no harm to him could get through, and anyone who was foolish enough to try would find themselves in trouble. The wards wouldn't kill outright, not even on the maximum setting, but there were several potentially lethal defenses, and they were almost the perfect defense. Firstly, the house was almost completely hidden. It was unplottable, and there was a modified version of a Fidelius covering the entire property. Only those who had been keyed into the wards could even be told the secret, and the secret keeper was the head of the Potter family or the heir when no head existed. And then there were the defenses themselves. It started with anti-apparition and anti-portkey, with the exception of the rings given to family members, wards, and strong muggle repelling and compulsion charms aimed at anyone who came wandering, be they wizard or muggle. If someone tried to beat the compulsion or managed to, and only a strong witch or wizard or a team of working together could do so, things became a little messy. It started out innocently enough, repeated waves of minor spells and hexes, irritants for the most part, bad bogey hexes, Avis charms, tickling charms, dancing charms, basic transfigurations on items of clothing, augmentee charms, jelly legs jinx, color-changing charms, and sticking charms. None of them were dangerous, but their purpose was to wear an attacker down, as they would be forced to keep up a shield and reverse the charms and hexes, which would take up a lot of magical power, and to ensure that they didn't take down the shield there were a few nastier spells in there, such as stunners and body binds. Not only was it designed to waste magical power, it would also make it more difficult to concentrate on taking down the wards themselves, and it would buy the manor's inhabitants time. It was never intended to stop someone, but to make them easier to stop. The next set of wards became much more dangerous. A whole barrage of offensive spells would assault the attackers, from stunners and body binds to fire and explosive spells. Nothing was intended to actually kill, only incapacitate, but that didn't mean that if someone was unlucky enough or wasn't able to keep their shield up that they couldn't be killed, although any intruders that were stunned or bound while in this level or higher would instantly be portkeyed to a small cell nearly a mile underground and at the far edge of the estate. Inside the cell food and water were provided, as well as a small bed, and one wall was enchanted to be a single-way mirror, to allow the Potters to see who they had captured. There were anti-apparition and anti-portkey spells in the cell itself, and only the head of the Potter family or the heir could command the magics within the cell, either to release someone or bring them into questioning. But it was the last stage which was the most dangerous. Not only did the same barrage of spells from the previous rounds continue to bombard the besiegers, but it was only now did some of Potter Manor's most feared defenses come into play. The ground upon which the last wards were raised was a trap. Once you entered that area, the ground gave way, dropping any attacker 50 feet into a labyrinth before closing above them once more. Not even the strongest blasting curses could cleave through 50 feet of solid rock. The fall itself would not kill an attacker. They wanted them to survive long enough so that they could be taken into custody and questioned, but even so the labyrinth was deadly. Not only was it pitch dark, but it was filled with a bewildering number of plants and golems, all designed to restrain or incapacitate, and unlike its name suggested, there was no way out. The only way possible was for the attacker to painstakingly carve out a passage to the surface and climb out. Not to mention that they had no food, and the only way they could get water was through a spell which required even more magical power, so it was very likely that before long they would collapse with exhaustion or hunger, and the moment they let their guard down they would be found and restrained. Nobody had ever passed Potter Manor's defenses, and few had made it as far as the trap, but the stories spread by those who had. Or those who had seen companions vanish before them before they turned tail and ran had spread throughout the wizarding world. Not even Voldemort at the height of his powers had dared to attack Potter Manor, but there had been the definite feeling that he would come eventually, when all else was destroyed, and then not even the manor would have protected them. Not to mention, it had been being used as a sanctuary for Muggleborns during the war, and James and Lily had preferred to raise Harry in a home where they could be certain it was not infiltrated. But Harry didn't know this. All he knew was that the wards were up, and he knew that he would have the knowledge of how to operate them if the house came under attack, and he would be able to defend his home. He lifted his hand off the stone, and instantly his legs gave way as a wave of fatigue swept through him, but before he could hit the floor he felt his paw arms catch him and he was pulled gently against a warm chest. "The wards are up," he murmured tiredly, and he felt his paw fingers start to stroke softly through his hair. "I know, puppy," came the whispered reply. "You did very well. Now sleep while I sort the house out." Harry was only too glad to comply. He vaguely registered that Sirius had stood and was carefully carrying him up the narrow tunnel, but before they reached the manor once more he fell asleep. Harry blinked tiredly, raising a hand to try and wipe the sleep from his eyes. His other hand scrabbled around for his glasses, knowing that his paw would not have put him to bed without putting his glasses somewhere within easy reach. Finding them, he grabbed them and shoved them onto his face before looking around curiously. He could see immediately that he was in what would now be his room, as all his things were spread throughout the room, placed on shelves and put away tidily. He'd rearrange everything, of course, but the fact it had been unpacked here told him strongly that this was definitely his room. A quick glance at his alarm clock told him that it was around 7 in the morning. It seemed that after he had powered up the wards he'd gone to sleep, and he'd slept through the remainder of the afternoon as well as the night. A growling in his stomach spoke loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday lunchtime and he was now definitely hungry, and another glance round the room revealed that his paw wasn't here either, and he knew that he didn't have a clue where anything was in the house, so he'd have to find his paw before he could do anything. He saw that the room he was in had 3 doors, and he wondered which he should try first. Quickly he decided that the best thing would be to look in all of them, and then he could decide which one to try, because although he wouldn't admit it, he was feeling a little nervous alone in a house he didn't know his way around, and he wanted to find his paw so he wasn't alone anymore, and he knew that he would be protected. The first door he tried revealed a hallway, and the second revealed a bathroom, but it was with the third that he struck gold. The door cracked open to reveal another bedroom, and his roving eyes caught sight of some of his pa's favorite pictures adorning the walls. It was obvious that this was Sirius's bedroom, and without any hesitation he headed into the room, a smile lighting up his face as he noticed the person asleep in the other bed. He crept forward, vaguely registering that he was in his pajamas and that his pa must have changed his clothes before he put him to bed. Stealthily he slipped round the bed until he was standing behind his godfather, Grinning to himself, he pounced on the sleeping form of his pa only to find that the man rolled away and an arm reached out and captured him, pulling him close. Instinctively he snuggled closer, even as Sirius's arms tightened around him and he found himself being tucked into a tender embrace. "Good morning, puppy." The amused voice of his pa came from above him. "Haven't you yet learnt that you can't surprise me in the mornings?" Pouting a little, Harry burrowed a little deeper into the safe hold his pa had him in. It was true though, even though he invariably tried to wake his pa up this sort of way, he had never managed to get the better of him. Of course, Harry still wasn't aware that Sirius made a point of placing wards around his doors, specifically designed to wake him if Harry came into his room in the night. They were mainly to deal with the nightmares, but Sirius had to admit that there were certain benefits, namely that he never got woken up by his godson in one scheme or another, because while Harry hadn't inherited James's passion for pranks, he couldn't deny that his child could create some very interesting schemes and plans if he felt safe enough to do so. Needless to say, it was usually Sirius that any such plans were aimed at, as Harry hadn't felt safe enough to target anyone else, and in their practice fights and dodging lessons he encouraged Harry to be as devious as possible. It was only natural that Harry would start trying to be devious at other times, although he had to admit that this side of his godson hadn't really come out until Harry had been living with him for over a year and a half. Sirius pulled himself up into a sitting position, keeping Harry tucked securely against his side. He was just about to start speaking when he heard his child's stomach rumble and he slanted an amused glance down at his child. "Am I to presume by that awful growling that I just heard that a certain puppy might be a little hungry?" he asked teasingly. In response, he felt Harry snuggle a little closer to him as a slightly sheepish, "Maybe," was heard. Chuckling lightly, Sirius pressed a key onto his son's head before gently shooing the boy back to his own room. "Get dressed and then I'll show you where the kitchen is, and I'm sure Mopsa and Kitsy will have something ready." Harry didn't need telling twice and he shot off in the direction he thought would take him to his room, only to chose the wrong door and end up in Sirius's bathroom. Sirius couldn't help the laugh that bubbled up and he smiled as Harry sent a rather betrayed look in his direction even as he pointed him in the direction of the correct door. "I'll show you round after breakfast," he promised him, "and it won't be long before you are running around here like you've lived here all your life." A few minutes later, Harry hurried back into the room to find Sirius waiting for him, and his pa smiled down at him before reaching down and taking his hand. He led Harry through the house, pointing out the different rooms and passageways. Harry tried valiantly to remember everything but soon gave up, settling for instead memorizing the main rooms. He'd be able to explore the house later, and if he managed to get lost in the passageways, he knew he could call either Kitsy or Mopsa, or his pa would feel his fear across the bond and come and find him. Soon they reached the kitchen, and within minutes breakfast was ready and Harry quickly dug in. They had nearly finished breakfast when a sudden pop made them both jump. Sirius spun round, his wand already in his hand, to see the figure of Tarbu. After a quick scanning spell to check that there were no tracking or control spells on the elf, he lowered his wand. "What is the matter, Tarbu?" he asked sharply, knowing only an emergency would have dragged the elf away from the chateau. "The bad men came back, Master Sirius," the elf said hurriedly. "They came and cast spells on Master's house, and then they asked us if you or the young Master had been there." Sirius froze for a split second before he recovered. "When did they come?" he demanded, reaching out to place a comforting hand on his child's shoulder as he felt the boy's nervousness leak across the bond. "Yesterday, Master Sirius," the elf answered quickly. "We told them that you and the young master had never been there and they left soon afterwards." Sirius nodded to himself. He hoped they would take the elves' word for it, but he knew that this still meant that he could not use the black properties again while he was still a wanted man. What did these men look like and how many were there? He fired off the next question rapidly, and the elf paused before he answered. "There were 15 men, all in hit wizard uniforms, Master Sirius, and they were joined by one with a long silver beard and bright-colored robes. One of the men had a wooden leg and a magical eye." Sirius frowned as he processed the information, so Dumbledore was searching too, and the team was likely being led by Moody. That indicated it was Dumbledore that was leading the effort to capture him, and that meant that he had to be more careful with his plans for Hogwarts, and it also indicated that there were few who knew that Harry was also missing. At least that was a boon. It meant Harry would not be ostracized by his fellow classmates and that he would not be hounded by the ministry seeking to put him in protective custody. Not that they could do a thing seeing as he hadn't been given a trial, and thanks to the intricacies of wizarding law a suspect could not be tried in absentia. But there was still the problem of what to do with Chateau Noir, because if they suspected even for a moment that he might be using it as a base, it was not a safe place to hide or for the elves to be. Coming to a decision, he addressed Tarbu. Put the chateau into lockdown and bring all the elves here to work on the farm. You may travel to the chateau once a week to perform general cleaning and maintenance, but you are not to put yourselves in danger. Tarbu nodded quickly. We will, Master Sirius. It was amazing. Sirius mused to see how fast house elves could act when you gave them an incentive to do so. Less than 20 minutes had passed since he had given Tarbu his instructions, but already the elves had put the chateau into lockdown, which involved moving all furniture and items to the Black family vault and putting the wards up at maximum strength, and had returned to Potter Manor. It had only taken another couple of minutes to give the elves their instructions, but soon they were settled quite happily in the farm, and Sirius knew that if they were not already fully self-sufficient, they would be in the near future. Once everything was sorted, Sirius continued the tour of the house, telling Harry about all the sorts of mischief he and James had managed to get up to in the hallways and rooms. He had expected it to hurt, and in a way it did. Many of the memories he was now sharing he had hidden away and not thought of because it brought back the pain of losing a brother, because that was what James had been to him, and the Potters had been more of a family to him than his real relations. It was hard coming back here, into a place with so many memories, but also being here was helping in its own way, helping him to remember the good rather than the bad, and to come to terms with the losses he had suffered. Harry seemed to pick up on his strange mix of emotions, of the undercurrent of sadness that laced every word and story, for he was uncommonly quiet. He had learned rapidly as Harry had become to come out of his shell that his child was perhaps the most curious child on the planet, and no lesson, whether it had been potions, astronomy, or history, had not gone by without him being subject to a barrage of questions from his child. But Sirius hadn't minded. He liked to answer the questions, he enjoyed the discussions, and he knew that while Harry had a tendency to be shy and timid around strangers, the almost constant questions were a sign of how much the child trusted him, and it relieved him to have that trust. A hand slipped into his, breaking him from out of his thoughts. Glancing down, he was met by the sight of anxious green eyes staring up at him. Pa? Harry asked worriedly, pressing himself closer to Sirius in an attempt to comfort him. Sirius sighed softly, then wrapped his arms around the slight figure of his child, and he dropped a key onto Harry's messy hair. I'm all right, little one, he murmured. Emerald eyes gazed back at him, filled with disbelief and concern, and Sirius couldn't help but be warmed by the obvious love his child had for him. I'll be all right soon, he amended quietly. I've just all the memories coming at me at once, and it's a little difficult. Harry nodded, but Sirius could feel hints of his confusion leaking across, and he knew that his child couldn't understand, but it meant so much to him that Harry was there with him and that he had the child. Drawing in a deep breath, he stood, gently pulling Harry up with him. If he was honest with himself, he knew that it wouldn't be the best idea for him to continue the tour today, and it would be a good idea to do something else for the rest of the day, just to give him time to come to terms with everything. He knew it wouldn't take too long. He just needed to become used to the place again, but until then it might be sensible to avoid the complete tour for a few more days. And on that note, I've been thinking about what Ollivander said about the animagus forms, he said lightly, and instantly Harry's attention snapped to him. Ever since the boy had been introduced to Padfoot, he had loved the large black dog, and he knew Harry had expressed a wish on more than one occasion that he could become an animagus himself, and Sirius had promised that he'd start to train him once the child had his wand. Chuckling at the eager expression on his son's features, he continued. I know I promised you that we'd start training, and don't worry, we will, he added as he felt a flash of his child's disappointment. But I thought that I might be a good idea to see if I can get you to change into a copy of my animagus form. Not only will it give you protection until you can master the transformation, here his expression turned a little mischievous, you will have to learn how to walk again, and that is a skill best done in a controlled environment. Harry glared slightly at his teasing, but Sirius just laughed as he reached out to ruffle the boy's hair, even as the excitement building on the child's face and through the bond told its own story. Suddenly, without any warning, he scooped the child up and settled him on his hip. Harry yelped in surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. wrapping his arms around Sirius's neck and burying his face in his godfather's shoulder. Sirius smiled as he keyed the messy black hair tickling his neck, before striding off down the corridors towards the dueling room. We'll practice in the dueling chambers, that way you can get used to things without any obstacles before I let you loose in the manner proper. A giggle greeted that statement and Sirius's bark-like laugh rang out in the hallway even as the portraits turned to look at them, many with smiles on their faces as they heard life and mirth return to corridors that had stood empty and desolate for 9 long years. Reaching the dueling chamber, Sirius swung Harry off his hip and settled him down on the floor. Quickly Harry bounded back to his feet and he stood, regarding Sirius with undisguised excitement. He ruffled the boy's hair fondly before concentrating on the magic of the bond. Ollivander had told him that it was possible, but that didn't mean that he had any clue how he'd go about changing Harry into an animagus form, and that was partially why he had suggested that they practiced. Not only would it allow him to work out how on earth he was supposed to do this, but it would also provide a good distraction that would absorb all his attention. Pulling up the magic of the bond, he focused on changing Harry into an animagus form. He didn't really know precisely what he was doing, but he knew that the bond would never allow him to hurt his child and that this was supposed to be able to occur, so hopefully things would work properly, and sure enough, as he focused on the magic, a thin stream of gold blossomed outwards from Harry's chest, covering the child completely before he slowly started to shrink, fur growing over his body as he slipped down onto 4 paws. It was nowhere as instant as the transformation was supposed to be, but Sirius got the sense that such ease would come with time and practice, and that the whole transformation today had only been as slow as it had been because he had been proceeding very cautiously, unsure of how the magic would respond. Finally the transformation was over, and in the place of Harry a small black Grim lay. He appeared to be the miniature form of Sirius's own form, although the Grim lying on the floor had the distinct look of a half-grown puppy, with his legs somehow a little too big for his body, giving the whole pup an gangly look. As he watched, the puppy raised its head, and looked around the room, curiosity shining in its eyes and flowing through the bond. Harry didn't think he'd ever felt quite so peculiar in his entire life. Everything was so big, and even his paw, who he'd never feared before, towered over him, making him slightly nervous. Everything looked different. All the reds, greens, oranges and yellows had shifted until they weren't much more than a couple of colors, and he could see blues, grays and purples so much more clearly, but it was not only his sight that had changed but also his sense of smell. He could smell things that he had never before considered to have a smell, and even smells that he knew had intensified and changed. It changed his perception of the world completely, and that made him slightly nervous, and he didn't quite know how to react. But after a few moments he became used to his strange surroundings and the new way he saw the world as the instincts of the Grim rose up in his mind, and he tried to stand only to promptly fall flat on his face. He heard a deep chuckle sound from about him, and he looked up with what he thought was an indignant look. Unfortunately for Harry, it is rather difficult for a puppy to look indignant, and he only made Sirius chuckle further as the man reached down and scooped the puppy up, holding a suddenly wriggling ball of fur gently in his fingers. "Hello there, Harry," Sirius murmured, his fingers stroking the soft black fur as Harry stopped wriggling and relaxed in his paw hands. The man smiled gently as he carefully checked over the puppy, making sure that everything had gone smoothly, and there were no obvious issues with the transformation such as missing body parts. Absently he noticed that the puppy seemed to be a little younger than he would have expected, but he knew that it was rare for children to become animagi, and usually when they did so they would mature very slowly, only coming into the adult form of their animal when they were in their late teens or early 20s. It hadn't been a huge problem for any of the marauders, but they had noticed that it had taken them several years after the initial transformation to attain full growth. Satisfied there was nothing amiss, or at the very least, nothing obvious, he sat Harry back down on the floor. "We'll start with teaching you how to walk, Harry," he instructed softly. "Once you've mastered that, we'll see if we can get you used to his instincts. I know they are a little disconcerting at first." The puppy gave a whine which may or may not have signified an agreement, but Sirius wasted no time in transforming into his own animagus form. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, he wanted Harry to be able to identify him in his animagus form and for the puppy to be able to relate to him in that form. And secondly, he remembered how difficult it had been to try and teach himself to walk, even with James trying to help him, Once the boy had finished laughing, of course, and he knew it would be far easier for him to teach Harry when he was a dog. The instant his paw shifted, the fur on the back of Harry's neck rose before he caught the smell of his paw. This new dog was Pack, was his father, and every bone in the puppy's body recognized this. His tail wagged against the floor and he tried to push himself up once more. This time he managed to get onto his front legs before he collapsed, a small whine escaping through his teeth. A second later, a cold nose nuzzled against his side, and Harry raised his gray eyes. He was a complete copy of his Pa Animagus form, just in miniature, to see the large form of a great black Grim standing beside him, gently encouraging him to get to his feet. Leaning rather heavily on Sirius's front forepaw, he managed to get onto all four paws and he stood, trembling against his paw leg as he got used to the sensation of standing on 4 feet. He felt his paw pride flow across the bond, and that gave him the courage to try and take an experimental step forward. Immediately he fell, and the only thing that prevented him from ending up as a furry heap on the floor was his paw nose, as the larger Grim gently supported the pup and nudged him back onto his feet. Several hours passed until Harry could walk and run unaided, but neither of them felt it was time wasted, and when Sirius finally changed back, all traces of his previous dark mood had vanished. Concentrating once more on the magic, he returned Harry to his natural state, and this transformation was a lot quicker. As a rumpled boy, his black hair messy and his glasses a little askew, appeared on the floor, in a somewhat awkward position, as the transformation had caught him just as he had overbalanced and tumbled to the floor. The child threw an indignant look at his godfather, but that look quickly melted into pure and unadulterated excitement and wonder. "That was brilliant!" Harry burst out. "Can we do it again?" Sirius managed to prevent himself from chuckling at the pleading in his child's emerald eyes. "Maybe tomorrow," he told the boy, amusement laced through his voice, "but I think lunch, and then perhaps your first flying lesson. Or," he glanced out of the window, noting the dark clouds that threatened a downpour in any minute, "I think I might be better if flying was postponed, and I could start your magical training." Dumbledore paced his office restlessly, as much as he hated that it had become necessary, that he had not managed to locate the child before now and ensure he was safe and out of Black's clutches. He had been unable to, and he had the suspicion that unless it was what Black wanted, they would not be found, and neither would Harry attend Hogwarts, and that meant he would have to do damage control. He had never released the initial news of Harry's kidnapping to the authorities. The Muggle world hadn't noticed. Well, they had, but a few well-placed oblivates had sorted that issue out, and the Wizarding world were still completely oblivious. It had seemed like a sensible decision at the time. Don't flash it up in the news and prevent Black from killing the child out of desperation or going to ground. And at that point he had honestly thought, even though Black had escaped Azkaban, that they would be able to find Harry quickly, heal any damage that Black had inflicted, and then place him with a well-meaning light family, because now the blood wards had fallen, there was no protection left for the boy back in Privet Drive. But as the weeks had stretched into months and then into years, he had begun to find himself losing hope, and he was being forced to contemplate what he would do if the unthinkable happened, that they sent out the letter and received no reply, if Harry didn't attend Hogwarts. He knew he couldn't reveal that the child had been missing for 5 years, kidnapped by Black, and he had hidden that information. Neither the public nor the ministry would understand that he had done what he did for the greater good, that is, was imperative that Black was not alerted to those hunting him. But if Harry Potter did not show at the sorting, there would be questions raised, questions that he would be loath to answer. He paused for a moment as an idea occurred to him. He would know if Harry was going to attend Hogwarts by July 31st, and it would be relatively simple, during August, to notify the ministry that Harry Potter had just been kidnapped and would need to be recovered with all haste. It wasn't the riskiest strategy he had thought of, although it certainly had its dangers, not in the least that if Harry was found and contradicted his story, things could get ugly very quickly. However, he consoled himself with the thought that if he hadn't been able to find Harry, it was highly unlikely that the ministry, with all their incompetence, would find him, and even if Harry was found, he knew that he was more likely to be believed than a traumatized child. He pulled himself together. All he could do was keep up the search, and do whatever was in his power to try and find the boy, but the situation was out of his control. All he could do was wait and hope, and after 5 years even that hope felt faint. "Pa!" Sirius looked up in amusement as his child came barreling through the corridors and into the study, his messy black hair ruffled even further by the speed at which he had raced down the hallways. In one hand he clutched a broom as his green eyes were pleading as he gazed up at Sirius. "Can we go flying today, Pa?" Harry asked eagerly, his excitement spilling over the bond. Sirius had taught him how to fly a few weeks ago and Harry had taken to it instantly, and Sirius was sure that he would be a better flyer than James ever was. They had enjoyed several days where they spent at least an hour flying, but then the English weather had taken its toll and for the last 2 weeks it had been nothing but downpours. While he knew that matches were played in such conditions at Hogwarts, Sirius had been loath to let his child fly, especially as Harry hadn't been flying for very long, and if he did get injured, something that was exponentially more likely in the rain, there would be no safe way to get him medical help. As such, they had been grounded the last 2 weeks, and while there had still been plenty of things to do, lessons in defense and magic, and sparing and dodging to practice, Sirius could tell that his godson had chafed at being on the ground. He was rapidly learning that Harry loved the freedom of the air and had a passion for flying that easily outstripped what both he and James had had. For Harry, instead of it being about Quidditch, flying was about freedom and the ability to go anywhere and everywhere. And when you had been hiding for nearly as long as you could remember, no matter how much you preferred hiding to where you would be otherwise, you still cherished every scrap of freedom that you could get. Sirius looked down at his child's beseeching face and glanced out of the window, noting that the sky was clear before he reached out and gave the child a hug. "I think that can be arranged, puppy. Just let me get ready and fetch my broom." A second later he had the air knocked out of him as a small boy collided with his midsection, wrapping his arms around him and chanting "thank you" over and over again. Sirius just chuckled, stroking the black hair softly for a few moments before he gently disentangled Harry's arms from his waist and propelled the boy with a light shove and a quiet, "Get ready and meet me in the hall in 10 minutes, in the direction of the door before heading up to his room to find his flying gear and his broom." They came back to the house late that afternoon, windswept and laughing, but no matter how much his child tried to hide it, Sirius could feel Harry's tiredness slipping through the cracks in his defenses and across the bond, and although it was time for a charms lesson, Harry hadn't cast more than 2 spells before he needed a break. Thankfully it wasn't long until supper, and straight afterwards Sirius put Harry to bed. He might have been getting a little old to be tucked in at night, but Sirius was going to do it until Harry came out and told him that he didn't want him to do so. Mere minutes later the child was asleep and Sirius rose, heading for his study. In the few weeks they had been here he could already tell where Harry's aptitude when it came to magic would be. He didn't have either of his parents' flair at charms or transfiguration. Although Harry was good at both subjects, he didn't have the natural ease that Lily and James had each possessed respectively, however he more than made up for it in defense. Even after a few lessons, Sirius could tell that his godson was going to be a force to be reckoned with when it came to defensive spells and dueling. He had mastered some of the basic jinx and hexes extremely quickly, and he had even managed to cast a shield in their last lesson. It hadn't held. It had barely been more than thin blue disk of magic, and it wouldn't have held up to any sort of magical assault, but Harry wasn't even a first year, and yet he had just cast a third-year charm, albeit an extremely shaky one. Sirius was incredibly proud, but the training had brought it home to him. Next September Harry would be going to Hogwarts, and he had to ensure that his child was still protected there. He couldn't let Harry go alone, he knew that much. Dumbledore had to know that Harry had been taken from the Dursleys, even though Ollivander's reaction indicated that the public did not know that Harry had been kidnapped. And therefore he knew that once Harry was at Hogwarts he would be in danger from Dumbledore, and at risk of being sent to the Dursleys again, and he didn't trust the Ministry to keep their noses out of Harry's guardianship, and he had no intention of his child being taken from him. It was too much of a risk to send Harry there alone, even if his child would know basic defensive spells and he knew martial arts. But he had been stumped on how to ensure Harry was not alone until he had seen Ollivander's reaction to them. He had thought that Padfoot was Harry's familiar at first, and he was well aware that it had only been because the man had a huge working knowledge of bonds and old magic that he had been able to identify the bond as a weird bond. And from his time in the Auror Force he had learnt that the spells to identify bonds, and familiar bonds, did not show the type of bond, merely that a bond existed, and as the knowledge of the old magics were restricted nobody would assume it was anything but a familiar bond. Under the Hogwarts Charter they were bound to allow a familiar to accompany any student, as the separation for any length of time could be dangerous to both wizard and familiar, and the rules were written to ensure that students didn't die. Therefore, under those laws, they couldn't prevent him from attending if he was proved to be a familiar. Of course, that strategy had risks, not the least that if he was caught with an animagus reversal spell, he would be caught. But foreseeing this precise difficulty, albeit before he realized that he would be able to travel to Hogwarts with Harry to ensure his child was safe, he had begun to work on a special shield charm that would shield against that spell, and that spell only. It was quite a complex piece of magic, but it wasn't the first spell the Marauders had invented. Heck, the map was almost entirely their own creation, and the spells they had used to tie the map to the Hogwarts wards themselves were the only ones of their kind in existence. The only problem he had been coming up against was that the spell couldn't be applied to a living being. He could make it cover a living being, but it would not stick, as it were, and the affect would wear off in a few minutes. However, he thought he had managed to find a way around the issue, namely that when applied to an inanimate object the spell would hold indefinitely. Now all he had to do was apply it to an appropriate object that he could wear, either as a dog or as a human, provided it would still apply once he was transformed. He was currently experimenting, and he was fairly confident he would get it to work sometime in the next few weeks. He was also trying to create portkeys which would work on the Hogwarts grounds. The Marauders had discovered a lot about how the wards worked when they had created the map, and now they were living in Potter Manor. Sirius had managed to locate their old notes, and he was hoping he'd be able to create portkeys which would work, in a similar way to how the headmaster could create portkeys which worked in Hogwarts. But just in case he couldn't get that to work, he was also placing a linking spell on a pair of pendants which he would then link to the manor. The aim was that he could activate the pendant, allowing the elves to know they were in danger and to bypass the wards to reach them and bring them to safety. He hoped it would be enough, and he knew he would plan harder and harder the closer it got to September, because Harry was his child and he was damned if he'd let him go to Hogwarts without the best protection he could give him. He loved the child far too much to ever lose him. Life in Potter Manor quickly settled down into a regular schedule. The first several weeks had been a bit of an adventure for both of them, Sirius as he came to grips with his history and living with a permanent reminder of the friends, no family he'd lost, for the Potters had been his family more than the Blacks had ever been. Harry was invaluable there, the bond allowing his child to know precisely when he needed something to cheer him up, and gradually the ache had receded. It had not left, and he was a fool if he though it ever would, but it was bearable. He had thought he had come to terms with his grief while they had lived in France, and in a sense he had. He had accepted the death of Lily and James, but being in the manor had been a bit of a blow, as he had been faced constantly with memories of the years he had spent here with James, and it had taken time to come to terms with that. But he was managing, and he knew that he had almost won. Harry had also had several adventures, although his thankfully had been a lot less troubling than his pa. The large manor and grounds with the myriad of passages and strange rooms that were hidden in a whole variety of interesting places were perfect for a young boy to explore, and he had spent many blissful afternoons getting as familiar as possible with the manor and getting lost and found again. And then there was the farm itself. Despite the fact they had lived in a small town in France, Harry still hadn't had much contact with a rural existence, and often, when there wasn't a downpour, Harry could be found down at the farm, either in the stables with the horses or out in the orchard and fields with the cows and sheep. The Potters had 2 horses, both large Shire horses which pulled the plows in the fields and did the other heavy pulling required on a farm. For a boy who had grown up with cars, trucks and tractors, the idea that you would need a horse to pull a plow was a little puzzling, but Harry loved that they did on the farm, because otherwise he wouldn't have any horses to visit and attempt to ride. It was lucky that the 2 animals were large and placid, and that a house elf was always on hand should the young master do anything too silly or dangerous. Harry was also still in contact with his friends from France, a fact which surprised Sirius, though perhaps in hindsight it shouldn't have. Harry had been writing to Remus with remarkable discipline for a child for several years now, and it was only to be expected that he had transferred that to his friends. Still, Sirius would be surprised if the contact stayed for that long. Regardless of how disciplined Harry was with letters, he knew how hard it was to keep contact, especially for children who didn't see either other often, and were at the stage where they were growing up and their paths were diverging. The lessons were coming along well. Sirius was over the moon with Harry's progress in defense. He was certain his child had a talent in that field. And that combined with the martial arts and dodging practice he had done while they lived in France would make him a formidable fighter in time. And he was sure that his child, even with what he knew now, would be easily able to defend himself and win against all the current first years and most of the second years, and hopefully by the end of the year he would be able to hold his own against most of the third and fourth years, not defeat them but to be able to hold his own for long enough for someone to get help and for the fight to be stopped or sorted out by a teacher. Hopefully it would also be unexpected, and Sirius knew all too well that sometimes it was the ability to do something unexpected, or to be able to defend yourself when nobody thought you were capable of doing so, could buy you precious seconds, and it only took a second to activate a portkey or call an elf. He hoped with every fiber of his being that he was being overprotective, that Harry would never need what he was teaching him, but in his heart he knew that that hope was false. It hadn't just been the ministry he had run from, although they had been the greatest danger for them at that point. He knew far too many Death Eaters had walked free, and Peter was still out there somewhere. They were safe where they were, and once Harry was out in the wizarding world he would be a target, but as much as he longed to, he couldn't hide Harry away forever. The world would come looking, and Harry would grow up and take the freedom that had been denied him, and when that happened he would be at a disadvantage if he hadn't been part of that world, if he didn't have any friends, if he didn't have social interaction, and being at a disadvantage could get his child hurt or killed. So as much as it hurt and worried him, Sirius was forced to acknowledge that it would be best if Harry went to Hogwarts. He would be damned if he let his child into that viper's nest without as much protection as he could offer him and a failsafe way to ensure he got home again in the holidays and summers, but Harry would go to Hogwarts. And seeing as the wizarding world had no idea that Sirius had him, if the reaction of Ollivander was anything to go by, Harry would be safe from them, and he would learn and grow, and Sirius would protect him from the Death Eaters and Dumbledore. Nobody would think an 11-year-old boy would be a danger, and although he knew that Harry would always be famous at Hogwarts, he would have the opportunity to be normal and do what was expected of him. Frankly, he knew his child would be in more danger if he didn't turn up. People would ask why, would begin to look, and sooner or later they would make a mistake and they would be found. As long as things appeared to be normal, Harry wouldn't be bothered hugely, and he would be around to ensure that when Harry was bothered it could be sorted quickly. He was reminded of an old saying he'd heard once: the best place to hide a tree is in the forest. And that was what he intended to do. He'd hide Harry in plain sight, just another child at Hogwarts, albeit a famous one, and he knew the pureblood elite paid little attention to their children, except to teach them about their world and their families standing within it. His parents had been exactly the same, subscribing to the position that children should be seen and not heard, and they paid little attention to their children until they reached owl level, and that would protect Harry. He would be ignored as a child by those who would do him harm until he was old enough to defend himself. It was ironic, really, he thought. They would refuse to see Harry as a danger until he had received enough training to actually be a danger, and their inaction would mean that when they started to move against him they would be unable to. Harry would be able to defend himself and would have friends and allies in the wizarding world who would be able to support him. He would deal with Dumbledore, and keep him safe from that angle, but whatever happened he swore to himself that his child would be safe. Harry stared at him, a curious mixture of excitement and fear pulsing across the bond. "We're doing what?" the child whispered, emerald eyes wide as they regarded Sirius with nothing less than unadulterated shock. "We're going to Diagon Alley, puppy," Sirius told him tenderly, carting his fingers through the child's messy mop. "I've talked to Ollivander and he's going to let us flow into his shop, and then we are going to go and explore the Quidditch shop and a few other places. It will be fun, little one." But Harry was already shaking his head. "You'll get caught, Pa," he cried. "I don't want to lose you." Instantly Sirius sank down onto his knees and opened his arms. Harry flew into his embrace and Sirius held him tightly, pressing a key onto his child's forehead. "You won't lose me, Harry," he murmured comfortingly. "Nobody but Remus knows about my animagus form, and he isn't in the country at the moment. We've been to Diagon Alley before and nobody has ever suspected a thing." He could feel that Harry was beginning to believe him, but he continued to speak quickly and softly. If he was going to go to Hogwarts with him, Harry needed to be sure that their ruse would not be discovered. "And anyway, Harry, even if someone suspected I was an animagus, I've invented something that will prevent them from transforming me so they wouldn't be able to show it was me. You will put your contacts in and we'll cover your scar with a bit of makeup and you'll wear a cap to hide your hair. Nobody will recognize you and you will get to spend some proper time in Diagon and experience some of the good things about living in Britain. Okay. The agreement was softly spoken, but Sirius could sense that his child did believe him and he was glad for that. He didn't want to confine Harry to Potter Manor for the rest of his life, even though his instincts were screaming for him to do so. He knew it wouldn't help his child in the long run, so he ruthlessly suppressed them. Harry needed to be a normal child, to experience the world he would have been raised and lived in if it hadn't been for that thrice damned Halloween. Sirius pulled him close once more, feeling Harry relax into the embrace before straightening and reluctantly releasing him. Go and put your contacts in, he instructed quietly, then come back and I'll deal with the makeup and the cap. He received a nod before Harry sped down the corridors, his socked feet slipping and sliding on the wooden floors. About half an hour later, Harry was ready and Sirius had triple-checked the collar and the collar tag he was going to wear. The anti-animagus revealing spell he had placed on it was the strongest he had been able to cast, as he had placed it on the metal tag. From his testing he knew it would withstand over 100 castings of the spell and it would be able to resist multiple castings of up to 20 simultaneously. They were going to flow into the back of Ollivander's shop. Sirius would have to flow in human form, but he had been owling Ollivander for several weeks now and the man had readily agreed to make sure that they had the flow addressed to his back room, which was closed to the public, and to speak to them before they went into the alley, as well as letting them use the flow once more when they were heading home. Sirius led Harry over to the fireplace and taking a handful of powder he stepped into the fire, Harry standing next to him as Sirius made sure he kept a tight grip on his shoulders. Harry was a little old for him to be flowing with Sirius, but seeing as the child had never flowed before and their situation was a little precarious, Sirius did not intend to take any chances that Harry could get lost or that they could be separated. Ready? He asked quietly, and he saw Harry's determined nod. He released the powder and the next second later they were gone, to reappear in Ollivander's back room. Sirius instantly found himself hanging onto Harry for dear life to prevent the boy from catapulting headfirst out of the grate. It appeared that he would have to give his child lessons on flowing when they got back to the manor. He pulled them both back onto a level footing before stepping out of the grate. With one wave of his wand the ash and soot vanished and he turned to the figure of the wandmaker. Thank you for allowing us to use your flow, Garrick, he said politely, but the old wandmaker just shrugged him off. It was nothing, he said, waving the thanks away. You provided me with the greatest challenge of my career and I have enjoyed our correspondence immensely. It has been so long since another wizard has asked me to help with regard to the creation of new spells, and frankly I find your projects fascinating. Sirius smiled at the man's sincerity, and he had to admit that Ollivander had been a tremendous help when it had come to the spell creation. The man's knowledge was astounding, not to mention the fact that he was well versed in many aspects of old and ritual magic which had proved invaluable. Sirius could certainly see why the Unspeakables had been desperate to discover some of his knowledge. Harry was standing a little uncomfortably behind Sirius. He knew that Ollivander wouldn't betray them or hurt either of them in any way, but after so many years of being on the run from the magical world and knowing full well what would happen if his paw was ever caught had made him wary. The old wandmaker glanced over at the child, a slight frown setting on his face as he saw how the boy was half hiding behind the figure of his godfather. Crouching down to the child's level, he addressed him directly. Hello there, Harry, he said quietly. How has that wand been performing for you? Sirius has told me you are getting very adept at using it. Harry flashed a quick look in the direction of his godfather, receiving a slight smile in return. It's very nice, he replied politely. It makes it much easier to cast spells and it's really good at defensive spells and jinx. His voice had risen during that sentence as some of his wonder and excitement grew in his voice, overpowering the initial wariness. Ollivander let out a delighted chuckle at the boy's enthusiasm. I'm glad to hear that, he replied. That wand is one of the finest that I ever crafted and it had a particularly affinity for defense. It certainly sounds like it is serving you well. He straightened, pleased that the child had lost some of his fear, and then turned to Sirius. You said there was a matter you wanted to talk to me about, he said seriously, something too dangerous to put in a letter. Sirius nodded, his thoughts immediately turning to the problem he needed to talk to the wandmaker about, even as his fingers rubbed gently through his child's hair in a silent message to wait patiently for a couple of minutes. Yes, he replied quietly, I know you originally took the bond to be familiar in nature, so would such a deception stand for those who were not versed in the old magics, or is it something that could be quickly exposed by a spell? He paused for a minute, then he spoke again. I suppose what I am really asking is how bonds such as these are detected, and how would one differentiate between them, or could this bond be taken for a familiar bond if they lacked knowledge of such bonds? Ollivander's eyes narrowed and he started to pace as his mind flicked rapidly through the options. Eventually he spoke. There is certainly a spell used to identify bonds, however it is so old that I am almost certain that I am the only one who is aware of its existence, and that if it were used, the old magic has been forbidden for so long that the knowledge it would reveal would be all but incomprehensible, so I doubt that is any danger to you. He paused before he continued. I know there is a spell which is usually used to detect familiar bonds, however I know that only looks for and responds to the presence of a bonding of whatever form, rather than an actual familiar bond, but as the knowledge of other bonds has been lost to the vast majority of wizards, if faced with a positive response for a bond between a wizard and a magical animal, a familiar bond is the only sensible conclusion, so on that front you are safe. Onto the aspect of actually seeing the magic. Very few have the gift, and again I am likely to be the only one in that group who knows of the existence of other bonds, let alone being able to recognize it. So on that front you are also secure. And if you do encounter another with the gift and they recognize the bond, they will know, like I did, that it would never allow you to hurt him. I cannot say whether magical creatures would be able to detect the bond for what it really is. Sirius grimaced at that. He knew full well that the bond could be recognized by magical beings, or at least goblins and house elves. However, Ollivander's next words removed a large portion of that worry. But considering how our ministry views non-human sentient species, I don't hesitate to say that any creature who recognized this would not be believed or trusted by the ministry, so you are safe from that angle. Sirius let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Most of this he had rationalized himself, however it was comforting to hear it from another source, and he was relieved to hear Ollivander's verdict on the aspects he hadn't actually known himself. It meant that his plans for going to Hogwarts with Harry disguised as his familiar would work, and he was unlikely to be discovered, which made the whole situation a lot more hopeful, because at least if he was at Hogwarts he'd be able to deal with the problems that might arise, and for those he couldn't handle, such as potions or spells, he was in the middle of working on a protective amulet that would alert him to the presence of any potions in food and drink, and he'd be taking the potions and materials necessary to nullify them if any were detected. They chatted for a few more minutes, but it wasn't very long before Sirius decided that they needed to go out into the alley before the crowds could get too large. He fastened the collar round his neck, but just before he transformed he turned to Ollivander. Once I've transformed, could you cast the Animagus reversal spell on me, please? I know the charm passed all the testing, but still it is better to be safe. Ollivander just nodded his agreement, and a second later the large black grim took his godfather's place. Harry watched with bated breath as Mr. Ollivander pointed his wand at his paw, and the silvery white of the Animagus reversal spell shot out of it. He trusted his paw with his life, and he knew the man would not do anything to hurt him, and that including taking risks that could see him back in Azkaban, but seeing the spell just flash white when it impacted with the black grim went a long way of dissolving his fears. His paw disguise was now perfectly safe. Ollivander smiled in satisfaction as he saw the spell give off a negative reading. Sirius had told him all about the testing, of course, but it was satisfying nonetheless to see it working with his own eyes. He smiled when he saw the young boy relax, although he noted that the child never actually let go of the dog's fur. He had observed in all their interaction that the child was very attached to his godfather, and he could easily see that the boy would be devastated if anything were to happen to him. He knew part of it had to be due to the bond. Due to the way they had used and developed the emotion bond, the two of them were connected in ways it was almost impossible for anyone else to understand, but he also understood it went deeper than that. Sirius Black was the only father the child had ever known, and he doted on him, and Ollivander could see that the child adored him in return. With a wave of his wand he unlocked the door that connected to the main body of his shop. He hadn't wanted to take the chance that anyone had opened the door by accident when Sirius had still been in human form. Such an occurrence would be more than dangerous, and he was not going to let an innocent man be given over to the Dementors. He was too aware of the key on-site order that had been given, and he would not be the one to hand an innocent to such a terrible fate. Harry looked around Diagon Alley in wonder. He hadn't really been paying much attention the last time he'd been here. He'd been far too frightened to look around, worried continually that his pa was about to be recognized and taken away by the ministry, but now he knew that his pa couldn't be recognized. He couldn't stop staring. It was a few days after Christmas and snow blanketed the ground and the window displays sparkled. It was completely different from anything he'd seen in the Muggle world, as strange signs creaked from rusty old poles, which sparkled as the sunlight caught the edges of the frost, and the windows were filled with a blinding array of goods, all with their own magical properties and purposes. It was a brilliant, wonderful and strange world, and yet he knew it was the world he belonged to, and even though he didn't linger on the thought, he also knew that there was darkness lurking in the shadows. In the deaths of his parents, in the fact it was Padfoot, not his pa, that was accompanying him, but these thoughts were pushed away as Padfoot began leading him gently in the direction of Aelop's Emporium. They had come to Diagon Alley for two things, firstly an owl and a broomstick. An owl was something that could not be purchased by owl, or perhaps strictly speaking house elf order, as keeping an owl inconspicuously in a Muggle town had been impossible, and while Sirius knew he could have ordered a broomstick by owl order, he wanted his godson to have the opportunity to look at the broomsticks before they ordered for one. Sirius knew that unlike an owl, it would be extremely difficult for Harry to purchase a broomstick without arousing suspicion. They entered Aelop's and Harry's mouth fell open. Having been raised in the Muggle world, he had never seen an owl up close, and suddenly he was faced with hundreds in close proximity to each other. There was not much he could do aside from stare. He knew he could choose one that would be used for both Sirius and him until his pa got his freedom, but he hadn't a clue where to start. He was broken out of his thoughts when he heard a cheerful voice behind him. "Need any help there, sir?" Harry spun round and came face to face with the saleswoman. He swallowed hard as he wondered what to say. He'd never been put in this position, and despite the fact he knew that she would not recognize his father, he was still more than a little jumpy. A sudden flood of reassurance and love flowed across the bond and cut through his worry like a knife, pushing it away. "Yes, please," he answered politely. "I'm looking for a good post owl, but I don't really know what to look for." He trailed off, looking down at the floor in embarrassment, but the witch just chuckled kindly. "Not to worry. You aren't the first Muggleborn I've seen that doesn't know what to look for in an owl. I'm guessing you want a way to keep in touch with your family when you go back to Hogwarts next term." Harry just nodded, not bothering to alert her to their cover story. If the woman already had a ready-made cover in her head, there was nothing for him to worry about. It would just make him that much more forgettable if she didn't think there was anything unusual about him. His nod seemed to have been completely sufficient as she patiently talked him through the owls, explaining the different types and which ones would be best for what jobs and how easy they were to look after. It took nearly an hour, but eventually he chose a beautiful snowy owl. She had explained that snowy owls were the most intelligent type of owl, and he also thought she was beautiful. When he shyly pointed at her, he felt Padfoot nudge his hand with his nose, and he felt his paw approval race across the bond. It was with a beaming face that he bought her, along with a wide variety of products that would help him care for her. He left the shop with one hand tangled in Padfoot's fur and with the other holding firmly onto the cage containing a large snowy owl. They stopped off at the Quidditch shop, of course. Harry spent nearly another hour staring at the brooms on display, but it hadn't taken Sirius more than 10 minutes to spot the broom he would be ordering for his child. While Harry had looked around the entire shop with great interest, he had spent the majority of the time gazing longingly at the broomstick in the window. But the crowds were beginning to swell, and although Harry had mainly conquered his fear of being in a wizarding area with his paw, large crowds were not something either of them were prepared to handle. So with a last longing look at the broomstick, Sirius gently led his child back to Ollivander's, and a few minutes later they were spat out of the flow, closely followed by the new owl, into Potter Manor. Albus Dumbledore had been on tenterhooks for the last several days. There was no hard and fast rule when a Hogwarts letter would be written and then delivered. It would occur sometime in the region of 2 to 3 weeks before the child's birthday, and as the end of July had slowly headed nearer, Dumbledore had been carefully inspecting every letter Minerva sent up to him for approval before sending them out. But so far not a single one had been Harry's, and Dumbledore was getting nervous. He was almost sure that the child was still alive. His name was still written in the Hogwarts list, but he couldn't help the concern that rose up in him. It was getting close, and the cutoff day for acceptances was in just under 2 weeks, and Harry's letter still hadn't gone out. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. "Come in, Minerva," he called out. His staff had not yet realized that he had a two-way mirror in the back of his door and it never failed to irritate them. Sure enough, his deputy wore a faint frown as she entered and handed over a few envelopes. "That's the last of them, Albus," she informed him briskly. "The quill has returned to the book to await next year's letters." Dumbledore felt tension bubble up in his gut as he took the packet of letters, but the years of playing a political role allowed him to keep his face free of tension, and he managed to smile as he thanked his deputy and she turned to leave. Despite her harsh tongue and the scalding temper she possessed when one of her Gryffindors or someone she cared for was hurt or placed in danger, he regarded her as a good friend and he knew she did an outstanding job as deputy. As soon as she had left the room, his attention turned to the letters. If Harry's wasn't here. He pushed the thought from his mind firmly. There was no good in dwelling in what ifs and maybes, and he did not need to start implementing Plan B until he knew that the letter wasn't there or that Harry wasn't going to be attending Hogwarts. He flicked through the first four, noting absently the names and whether or not they were Muggleborn and would require a professor to deliver the letter. He picked up the fifth letter and a sigh of relief escaped him. Written in glowing emerald green was the name Harry Potter. Dumbledore's eyes drifted down to look for the address. If he could obtain it, he would be able to summon Alistair and lead a team of Hitwizards there tonight and locate the boy. It was so simple he couldn't believe it had never occurred to him before now, but he quickly noted that in place of an address, the location of a French post box was prominently displayed. He felt a stab of regret at the missed opportunity, even as he felt a grudging admiration for the man's cleverness. A post box in the middle of nowhere would give out no clues to their location whilst still enabling them to receive mail, giving him the ability to order virtually anything in the wizarding world via OWL. It also ensured that even if the post box managed to be traced, they wouldn't be found, and he guessed it was a simple matter to obtain another box. And it didn't even indicate that they were in that country. Dumbledore suspected that Black used a house elf to collect the mail. Such a strategy would be almost impossible to counter. House elves were notoriously tricky to work with or even to capture unless you caught them by surprise, and once you had captured them, unless the elf was intensely disloyal to their master, which only occurred rarely, getting information out of them was extremely difficult. He briefly entertained the idea of trying to capture one of Black's elves, but he discarded it rapidly. Judging from what he'd seen of them when he'd visited the manor, he was certain they were very loyal, and getting any decent information out of a loyal elf when their master was alive was harder than trying to get Cornelius to do anything without a bag of gold. However, placing a monitoring charm over the area seemed to be a good idea. There was very little chance that Black would actually visit that area, however, it wouldn't hurt to place a charm there, and if he did, Dumbledore didn't want to waste that opportunity. This was the only lead on Black he had, and even though it was slight, he had no intention of wasting it. It was at breakfast that the letter arrived. Neither of them noticed it at first. The house elves had done their usual efficient job of collecting the mail from the unmarked post box that still resided in a small corner of France, placing it on the counter of the kitchen, ready to be examined as soon as Harry and Sirius had finished breakfast. It didn't take long for the meal to be finished, and Sirius had just finished the last of his coffee when he turned around to see his child standing stock still, his eyes fixed on something in his hands. Instantly Sirius became concerned. Harry was always so lively, always curious and always moving, so the fact he was standing frozen indicated something was seriously wrong. "Harry?" Sirius asked quietly, his hands reaching out to touch the child's shoulders in comfort. "What's the matter, puppy?" Even as he spoke the words, he was reaching out across the bond, sending as much love as possible over it, as well as absorbing Harry's emotions, trying to work out why his child was upset, but the mixture of excitement, nervousness, fear and happiness he could feel confused him. Gently he wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders, pulling him close as he glanced down, trying to ascertain what had caused such a mixed reaction in his child. The bright emerald green of the Hogwarts ink winked up at him, and he pushed down his own sudden rush of nerves. "Go ahead and open it, Harry," he said softly. "It won't bite you," he added teasingly when Harry still didn't move. No matter the unease seeing the letter generated within him, Sirius was determined that Harry should be able to look forward to Hogwarts. Receiving the letter was a defining moment in a young wizard's life, and some of his best memories had occurred in his Hogwarts years. He knew it would be dangerous for Harry, and he was not letting his child go there without all the protection he could give him, but he was determined to make sure that Harry enjoyed his time at Hogwarts. Emerald eyes looked up at him, Harry's mingled apprehension and wonder obvious in their depths, and the question they were asking was clear. "Open it, puppy," Sirius told him quietly, wrapping the child in an embrace. "I know you're worried, but the time I spent at Hogwarts was brilliant, and I promise that I won't let anything hurt you, or take you from me." Finally, Harry's fingers moved and opened the envelope, taking the 2 pieces of parchment out. Neither of them had to look to know what they said. Harry had done so much magic there was no chance that he would not be accepted, but still, seeing the words on the parchment had caused the excitement to rise up inside him. But as Harry read through the letter, an equipment list, a frown touched his face. "Pa, it says I can only take a cat, owl, or a toad." Sirius chuckled lightly. "The professors don't like the students knowing all the little rules contained in the bylaws, so of course James, Remus, and I spent as much time as possible finding them out." Harry grinned. He had heard many stories about the sort of trouble his dad, Pa, and Uncle Mooney had got into at Hogwarts, and while he knew he wasn't a prankster in the same way they were, it didn't mean he didn't enjoy a prank now and again, provided nobody was hurt or routinely picked on. Sirius returned the smile as he continued. "One of the pieces of information we unearthed was that while they have a pet rule, they cannot prevent a student's familiar from accompanying them to the school, as such a separation is dangerous for the child involved, particularly when the bond is new, so to speak." Understanding dawned in Harry's eyes. "So you're going to pretend that Bardolph is my familiar?" At Sirius's nod, a delighted smile grew on the child's face, but in the next instant the smile was wiped away and Sirius clearly felt the rush of fear that swept across the bond. "But they'll catch you," Harry whispered, his fear plain in his voice. Sirius hugged him closer, pressing a key onto his child's forehead. "Of course they won't, puppy," he soothed. "Remember when we went to Diagon Alley and Ollivander tested the Animagus reversal spell on me and it didn't work?" He waited until he saw his child's nod before he continued. "I've got a spell that prevents that from transforming me back, so nobody will know that I am Sirius Black. I won't get caught, and when they find the bond they will assume it is just the familiar bond." Harry had slowly been relaxing as Sirius had been speaking, and now he turned up to face his pa, a hopeful expression on his face. "You really will be safe." "I promise I will be." Sirius waited for that to sink in before he spoke again. "And that isn't the only thing that we have to help us. Ollivander and I have come up with several devices that will keep us safe, and I know from your lessons that you are more than capable of beating all the first, second, and third years and holding your own in a duel with a 4th year. You will go to Hogwarts, have fun, learn magic, and make friends, and I will keep you safe." Sirius let out an internal sigh of relief when he saw his child nod slowly, some of his earlier excitement beginning to glow once more on his features. He had meant every word he had said, of course, and he would keep Harry safe even if it was the last thing he did, but he couldn't help the disquiet that rose up in him at the thought of moving permanently back into the spotlight the wizarding world would thrust Harry into. Intellectually, of course, he knew that in the long run Harry would be in more danger if he didn't go to Hogwarts, but that didn't stop all his instincts from screaming at him, or completely squash the part of him which wanted to haul his child into his arms and then to run so far that nobody would ever find them. He pushed that thought away. Harry understood the risks, knew what he couldn't talk about and what the cover story was, and there were many things that he had developed that would help keep both of them safe. He would make sure Harry knew how to work each and every one of them, and he would be safe, but at the moment they had a letter to write and Harry was safe in his arms where he belonged. McGonagall's eyebrows rose steadily as she read the newest acceptance letter, letting out a gasp as she took in precisely what it meant, and precisely which animal Hogwarts would be playing host to next September. She took a deep breath and read the letter again. Slowly. Once she was certain she had absorbed all the pertinent information, she sat back in her chair, a frown on her face. She knew she was going to have to tell Albus about this new development. Familiars were tricky ground. They couldn't prevent any true familiar from coming because the long-term separation could prove dangerous at best and fatal at worst, but still, a Grim was liable to cause panic, particularly among the wizard-raised. They would cross that bridge when they came to it, she told herself firmly as her eyes drifted down to the letter once more. What was more interesting than the animal, however, was the people who had sent the letter, Harry Potter and his guardian Patrick Evans. She had been waiting uncomfortably for the acceptance letter, she had had her reservations when they had left Harry with his relatives, and despite Dumbledore's assurances she still hadn't been satisfied. And with good reason, she thought, looking down at the names on the letter. Harry had obviously moved out of his aunt's care into the hands of another relative, a cousin or similar, she presumed, judging by the fact she knew Lily hadn't had a brother and the surname of the man was Evans, and she knew enough about the Muggle world to know that the only cause of a child moving custody was if the previous guardian had been found unsuitable, or perhaps they had simply given the infant to their cousin, unwilling to take care of the child. She snorted to herself. From what she had observed of those Muggles, she wouldn't put it past them to have done so. Sighing to herself, she stood. Harry's was the last letter to come in, with the exception of a Muggleborn she was due to visit in 2 hours' time, and she might as well notify Albus now. Certainly there were arrangements to be made surrounding the familiar, and seeing as the headmaster had been the one to place the child with entirely the wrong Muggles, Minerva was going to enjoy placing all the paperwork to deal with bringing a familiar into the school squarely in Dumbledore's lap. It could in no way compensate for the mistake he had made, and she would thoroughly chew him out over it later, but making him do the paperwork would at least make her feel a little better. Dumbledore looked up in confusion as he heard someone knock, and he put the ministry paperwork to one side, calling, "Come in, Minerva," as he did so. Inside he was more than a little perplexed. He hadn't been expecting a meeting, and there was nothing that should have gone so seriously wrong that she needed to come and see him. His eyes swept quickly over his deputy, noting the parchment held in her hand and the glint in her eyes that automatically had him bracing for a shouting match. "Is there something wrong, Minerva?" he asked solicitally, and he wasn't prepared for the blaze of anger that swept his way as Minerva rounded on him, her Scottish brogue thickening as it always did when she was extremely upset. "Ye left that queer defenseless bairn on that doorstep, and ye didna even think to check up on him, and now I find he's got a new Muggle guardian. I dread to think what that queer bairn dealt with in that house before he was moved. I told ye they were the worst type of Muggles, I told ye, Dumbledore, but did ye listen?" An indignant snort conveyed the depths of her displeasure and contempt more clearly than any words could have done, and Dumbledore couldn't help but inwardly wince. He hadn't really paused to consider what Petunia had revealed about Harry's living conditions when he had visited their home. He had been far too preoccupied with the problem that Harry had vanished and was almost certainly in the hands of Black, but he couldn't deny that when the understanding of what Petunia had meant when she said cupboard had dawned, he hadn't been able to help but be grateful to Black for removing Harry from that. It hadn't lasted, overshadowed with the knowledge that whilst the child was being neglected, he hesitated to say abused, but internally he couldn't deny that the situation had had some aspects of abuse to it. While he lived with his aunt and uncle, the blood protection would keep him safe from Voldemort, and he was almost certainly suffering far worse at the hands of his parents' betrayer. However, he couldn't deny that when the blood wards had finally fallen, a couple of months after Harry had disappeared, that inwardly he had been slightly relieved that Harry wouldn't have to go back, and when he was found he could be placed with a well-meaning light family that would ensure he was brought back to the light. "I know I made mistakes, Minerva. I had thought Petunia would be able to accept her nephew for her sister's sake, and I am sorry for that. I am just pleased Harry found such a good and loving home." The older woman snorted again, not placated in the least by the apology. "It's the bairn ye owe that apology to, and if Patrick Evans hadna given him a home ye'd have more than I'd answer to." Dumbledore sighed, but didn't answer, knowing full well that his deputy would only become more irate if he tried to defend himself again or apologize. He would be much better served just waiting until she calmed down and finished what she had to say. And he would have to wait until he was alone to process the name he had just been given as Harry's guardian. McGonagall beeped in a deep breath, and it was obvious that she was putting a great effort into controlling herself. "While I fully intend to discuss Harry's living arrangements with you again in great detail, Albus," he winced at the sharp edge to her words and the clipped tone she was using, informing him that he would receive a second dressing down later. "I have a Muggleborn I need to perform an introduction for, and I have been notified that one of the first years has a familiar that they will be bringing to us next year. I leave the matter entirely in your hands. However, if I discover any discrepancies," the emphasis on the word was obvious and he had to suppress a second wince, "I will not hesitate to make my displeasure known." With that parting shot she placed the letter squarely on his desk and turned to sweep out of the room in a gesture eerily similar to that of his potions master, although both would deny they had anything in common. Just as she reached the door, a thought came to Albus and he called after her, "Witch student Minerva." The elder witch paused slightly on the threshold, turning backwards slightly. "Harry Potter," she replied before sweeping out of the room, letting the door bang shut behind her. Dumbledore realized his mouth was open and quickly snapped it shut, his hands automatically reaching for the letter and his eyes devouring the contents before he could think about what he was doing. He read it through once, then he read it again, and it was only after the third reading that he placed the letter carefully on his desk and leaned back to process what he had learnt. Harry Potter was bringing a familiar, and a Grimm at that. Of course he would test that it was a genuine familiar, but he suspected it would be. Black wasn't an animagus, and even if he had been an Auror and was familiar with the spell that would reveal the presence of familiar bonds. The fact that Child's familiar was a Grimm though was extremely intriguing. There had never been a recorded bonding between a Grimm and a human before. Grimms tended to be reclusive and they were hardly seen except as an omen of death, but if he thought about it, there was certainly some logic to the pairing. The boy who beat death now had Death's companion as his familiar. However, the inclusion of the animal was going to pose a problem, particularly amongst the magically raised children and purebloods. The idea of the Grimm was so firmly rooted in their mythology and superstitions that the reactions to it were likely to be violent. However, he couldn't prevent the creature from coming. The consequences were far too severe for him to contemplate that. He considered the idea of requesting it remained in the dorms, but he discarded the idea after mulling over it for no more than a couple of minutes. Confining what was in essence a large dog to such a small space was asking for trouble, if it was even possible. The powers that Grimms possessed were largely unknown, but there was certainly evidence they didn't require normal means of travel, so confining the creature could prove to be impossible, and it would only serve to alienate the child, which was something he could not afford to do. He knew the child had been in Black's hands for the last several years, regardless of the Muggle name on the letter, and whilst he was thrilled the child was going to attend Hogwarts, he knew he had a precious chance here, and it would only take a few words or actions to muck up the child's trust and send him down the dark road. He hoped with all his being that the child was not already dark, perhaps nearly irretrievably, but he couldn't see how the child couldn't be after so many years of being raised by his parents' betrayer. However, the Muggle name on the letter presented an intriguing possibility. Could Black have taken Harry and not told him of his history and his actions, and instead had posed as an uncle or cousin of Lily's and attempted to raise the child correctly? He hoped it was the case, however he knew it was unlikely. What was far more likely was that the name was an attempt to throw those who asked Harry about his living situation off the scent, as people would presume Patrick Evans was a relative of Lily's. And he thought it had certainly worked, particularly as the wizarding world was oblivious to Harry's kidnapping. Although the acceptance letter provided him with a quandary of what to do now, or more specifically when the first holiday came and Harry wanted to go home. He couldn't be allowed to return to Black, of that Albus was certain, but the problem was how to achieve it without Black taking Harry back or without the child lashing out. Finding a family to take the child in would be easy. Albus was certain a family like the Weasleys would take the boy in a heartbeat. Molly couldn't resist a child in need, but the problem would come with preventing Black from taking the child back, as it had been proved that he could get around the strongest wards without anyone having the faintest idea of how he did it. The other problem he could foresee was if Harry had been loved and cared for by Black, he would not wish to trade that family for another, and it would make any attempts of convincing the child of his guilt that much harder, especially when his history with the Dursleys was taken into account. Dumbledore sighed. It was all well and good to deal with what-ifs, but he couldn't attempt to deal with the situation until he saw Harry. It would only be then that he would be able to determine an appropriate approach to take. Harry stumbled out of Ollivander's flow, into his paw-ready arms, a grimace adorning his face. He hated traveling by flow. Not only was the spinning disorientating, but he never seemed to land properly, or exit a flow without stumbling. "You'll get better with practice," Sirius assured him as he brushed the soot from Harry's robes, chuckling slightly at the hint of a pout on his child's features. Harry made a face at him, but he couldn't hold any irritation at his paw for long. It was hard to be irritated and stay irritated when he could always feel precisely how much his paw loved and cared for him. "Ready, puppy?" Sirius asked quietly, casting a critical eye over the child, even as he examined Harry's emotions through the bond. He could feel the nervousness there, and the hint of fear that lurked just behind the excitement and determination, but it was far better than the paralyzing fear that Harry had shown when they had first come to Diagon. Slowly Harry was beginning to trust in the charms Sirius had cast. He was still wary of course, and he would always be wary particularly as he could easily feel Sirius's own wariness, but he knew that provided nothing went wrong they would be safe. And today they were just shopping for school supplies, getting robes fitted and similar, and slowly Harry would become accustomed to being around wizards and witches before he got to Hogwarts, along with the idea that Sirius would be safe when he did so. Sirius smiled gently at his child, ruffling his hair with his free hand before transforming into Padfoot, checking to see that the anti-animagus revealing charm was attached firmly to his collar before nudging open the door with his nose and heading out into Ollivander's shop and the alley beyond, with Harry's hand buried deep in his fur. Harry fidgeted as he stood by the fireplace, his fingers fiddling with the medallion at his throat as he waited for his pa to finish giving his instructions to the elves before they left for the Hogwarts Express. The medallion was one of several unique protective items he was wearing somewhere on his person, but it was the easiest for him to fiddle with. When his Hogwarts letter had come, his pa had told him that Ollivander and himself had created several items that would help to protect him when he went to Hogwarts, but he hadn't quite understood how many different things he had that would help to keep him safe, even though his pa was also coming to look after him and protect him. He had been worried about his pa coming with him. He knew that Pa had escaped jail and there were people who were looking for him who would kill him if they found him, but nobody knew about his animagus form, and Harry had seen the charm he had come up with that would prevent anyone from changing him back. They had been to Diagon Alley a few times after he had received his letter, and when each of those visits had passed uneventfully he had relaxed. He was still worried about it, and frightened, but he knew that as long as he didn't make any mistakes his pa would be fine, and it also relieved him to know that his pa would be there, that he would not have to leave him behind. Harry smiled as he felt a wave of love flow down the bond, wrapping around him and cocooning him in its warmth. It was the best thing about the bond. His pa always knew when he was upset, sad or anxious, and the feeling of his pa love wrapping around him was without a doubt the best feeling in the world. Without thinking about it he sent his own wave of gratitude and love back. Using the bond had become more and more natural the longer he had spent with Sirius, and although he could remember a time when there wasn't the constant presence of the bond and the emotions behind it, those memories always felt like there was something missing. His fingers brushed against parchment in his pocket, distracting him as he pulled it out and looked at it. He was confused for a second before he remembered that this was his own special version of the Marauder's map that Pa had made from him. While it still had some features of the original, such as an entry password and the fact it showed every person in the castle, Sirius had also updated it to include several special features which included safe areas and escape routes. If he got into trouble when he had the map, and he had some warning, he could request an escape route and the map would automatically lead him to one of the safe areas, avoiding other people and making use of the secret passages. It was one of the things his pa had created to keep him safe, and his fingers went to the medallion again. While Sirius hadn't managed to create a portkey capable of punching through the Hogwarts wards, the medallion got around that problem. As well as being enchanted with a few low-level protection charms, the sort of things that would dispel ordinary compulsion charms, loyalty potions, love potions and similar spells and concoctions, it was also connected to the medallions that every one of the elves at the manor had been issued with. All it needed was a voice activation, the command, Heil, an Old Norse word meaning safe, which had been chosen as it wouldn't come up in normal conversation, and two elves would instantly leave what they were doing and pop Harry and Sirius back to the manor. It was almost certainly better than a portkey his pa had told him, seeing as the vast majority of wizards ignored their house elves and because of that they didn't bother to ward against them, especially many wizards believed themselves to be superior, whereas the majority of the wizarding buildings had anti-portkey wards. And that was just stupid, Harry thought. The house elves were brilliant. He could happily play for hours in the barn with Kitsy, and he had discovered they were great to talk to, or they would be willing conspirators on the odd occasion that he felt like playing a prank on his pa. He had two, well, three if he counted the two air rings separately, more items that were designed to keep him safe. The black air ring protected his mind, making sure his occlumency was secure. Harry grimaced whenever he thought about occlumency. His pa had been teaching it to him for nearly 5 years now, and he still couldn't achieve more than a weak shield that wouldn't stand up to any sort of assault for very long. He was doing everything his pa said, but he still couldn't make it stronger, making him very glad to have the ring. He didn't want to lose his pa just because he couldn't protect his mind. The Potter ring, on the other hand, didn't protect him directly. Instead, it was imbued with healing magic that would boost his natural healing processes, ensuring that any injury he got would heal faster, and that poisons and offensive potions would take longer to work, giving him more precious seconds and minutes with which to get the antidote. It wouldn't do too much against fatal injuries or things like werewolf bites, but it would slow the time it took for such a wound to kill him, again giving him extra minutes where it would be possible to save him. The final item he had was also a ring, purely because it would be the easiest thing to wear, seeing as he already had a medallion. In terms of purely physical protection, it was the most powerful, as it was a shield charm that would protect him from all minor and some of the moderate hexes and jinx. Of course, it wouldn't do much against any of the really dark curses or powerful dueling spells, but its presence on his finger still reassured him. After all, he wasn't going to face unforgivables at Hogwarts. A hand on his shoulder broke him out of his thoughts, and Harry turned to his pa. "Ready, puppy?" the man asked gently. Harry bit his lip and impulsively reached out for a hug, to be gathered up instantly, the soothing presence of his pa's love and concern calming him slightly. "I'm nervous," he admitted quietly, and he felt Sirius hold him a little bit tighter. "Of course you are, puppy," he replied softly. "Everyone is nervous when they first go to Hogwarts. Goodness knows I was, and I couldn't have been more eager to get away from my parents." "It's not just that," Harry said quietly. "I know you're coming as Bardolph and that you'll be there, but I won't be able to speak to you or have hugs or—" His voice trailed off and he felt his pa press a key to his forehead. "I know I'm going to be in my animagus form for the majority of the time, but that doesn't mean that I can't be there for you, and even if I can't answer you with words, there's still the bond." "I suppose so," Harry agreed a little reluctantly, but Sirius hadn't finished speaking. "And there are the safe areas. I can't transform often, but if there is something really urgent or you need me to be human, we can go to one of those places and I can transform safely. The come and go room in particular is very safe, as we can ask the room not to let anyone else in when we are in it, and it won't appear for anyone, even if they are looking for it." Harry relaxed at the assurance, suddenly feeling a lot better. He was still extremely nervous about going to Hogwarts, of course, but it was better now. Sirius could feel the precise moment when his child calmed down sufficiently and he stepped back, releasing the child from his embrace. "We'd better head off. Ollivander has been extremely kind to volunteer to see us off from the station, and we shouldn't keep him waiting." Harry took a deep breath and nodded before grabbing a handful of flow powder and stepping into the emerald flames, Sirius following behind with Harry's trunk and Hedwig. Harry grimaced as he fell out of the fireplace, soot in his mouth. Despite the practice he had done at the manor, he loathed flow travel, and he still managed to land on his face every time he tried that mode of transport. A gnarled hand helped him up with surprising strength, just in the nick of time as Sirius stepped gracefully out of the fireplace, into the place Harry had been lying merely seconds before. "Thank you, Garrick," Harry said quietly and a little self-consciously. They had traveled to Diagon Alley several times over the summer, always flowing to Mr. Ollivander's shop, as the old wandmaker and his pa had struck up a somewhat peculiar friendship since the first fraught meeting when Harry had come to buy his wand and their secrets had been discovered. Although it had been a slow process, Harry had relaxed around the man, knowing that he would not hurt or betray them. However, he had still been caught off guard when the man had told him, quite firmly too, to call him by his given name. "Thank you for agreeing to do this, Garrick," Sirius said gratefully as he checked that all Harry's luggage had made it safely through the flow system, but the old wandmaker waved his words away. "Don't worry about it, Sirius, it's the least I could do." He sent a grin at Harry. "Every boy needs someone to show him off onto the express, and I'm perfectly happy to help out there. It's something any friend would do. Not to mention that I get the pleasure of sticking my proverbial nose up at the idiots who run our society, even if they don't know I'm doing so." That comment won a laugh from both Sirius and Harry. There was little love for the ministry in their family, not only because of what they had done to Sirius but also for the fact that they had made this hiding necessary, and both of them enjoyed seeing the ministry suffer. Ollivander turned so he was facing the mirror, his brow furrowed as he carefully applied a glamour, subtly giving them privacy before Sirius had to turn into his animagus form for the foreseeable future. The instant Ollivander's back was turned, Sirius opened his arms and Harry ran into them immediately, not caring what he looked like as he clung onto his father. He knew that his pa was still going to be with him as Bardolph and he was grateful for it, but in some ways it wouldn't be the same as having the person there. While he still had the bond, the Grimm couldn't give him hugs, hold him when he had nightmares, or simply to be there to murmur comfort when he was afraid or worried. Harry felt Sirius press a key to his head as the man held him tightly. "It will be all right, puppy," he murmured, "and just because I am going as a Grimm doesn't mean that I won't be there for you, or that I can't be human if you need me to be." Harry just nodded from the place where his head was buried against his pa's chest. He felt the hug tighten for a moment and love rushed down the bond, before Sirius stepped back, love clear in his gray eyes before a large black Grimm took his place. Harry took a deep breath even as he twisted his fingers securely into the dog's fur, and he turned to look up at Mr. Ollivander, the glamour making him appear like any young wizard father. The old wandmaker smiled at him, although Harry could detect hints of sadness and pity in the smile as the man picked up his trunk and Hedwig's cage. "Let's get you to the station," Ollivander said quietly, a hint of an emotion Harry couldn't quite identify in his voice. "There's only an hour until the express goes and I wouldn't want you to miss it." Harry couldn't help staring as he gazed at the Hogwarts Express for the first time. Like many other young boys who had grown up in the Muggle world, he had always enjoyed going on trains and had been fascinated by them, but he had thought the only places proper steam trains still existed were in museums, so to be confronted with a full-life, full-scale working steam train that he was going to ride meant he couldn't help but stare. "It is real, right?" he asked before he could think about what he had actually said, and he heard Ollivander chuckle. Instantly he felt his cheeks heat. "It is real," the man reassured him, "and I dare say that you aren't the first to have that reaction." Harry just looked away a little shyly. He might feel reasonably comfortable around Ollivander, and he knew that the man wasn't about to betray them, but still he couldn't help be a little wary. His pa was the only adult he trusted fully, and he had no doubt that it would remain that way for a while. He felt the cold nudge of a wet nose against his leg, and he looked down to come face to face with his pa gray eyes. A smile tugged at his lips as he buried his hand deeper in the Grimm's fur, secure in the knowledge that his pa was with him. A muted gasp caused his head to snap up as his eyes searched for the sound. It was then he realized that several witches and wizards were giving them a large berth, fearful eyes fixed on the Grimm beside him, and his pa warning about the reaction his animagus form would prompt in people rose in his mind. He bit his lip and glanced up at Ollivander, who was surveying the surrounding crowds with something akin to amusement. "Idiots," he thought he heard the man mutter before Ollivander turned to him. "Let's get you on the express then, and don't forget to send me the odd letter now and then. I have to say I'm looking forward to hearing about the knots you tie those overbearing fools into." Harry's lips twitched at that sentence, and he felt the rumble of Sirius's laughter beneath his fingers. He couldn't deny that after everything the Ministry had put his pa through, that he would enjoy getting some revenge and pulling them down a peg or two, provided it didn't endanger his pa. Soon his trunk was safely stowed away on the express, and Harry turned to Mr. Ollivander, tugging a little uncomfortably on the cap he was wearing to hide the trademark Potter messy hair. He knew the man was pretending to be his father, showing him off onto the express, but he felt extremely uncomfortable at the thought of anyone but Sirius in that role. He couldn't imagine anyone taking his pa's place. His emotions must have been showing on his face though, because Ollivander just laid his hand on Harry's shoulder, giving it a firm pat. "Enjoy yourself at Hogwarts," he instructed. "Make all three of them proud, and when the idiots aren't looking, give them hell for me." Harry just nodded, not knowing what to say. He knew that the Ministry and Dumbledore deserved to have some sort of trouble caused, but he didn't want to do anything that might risk either him or his pa. Well, perhaps he could prank Dumbledore once or twice, just to get a little revenge. That wouldn't risk either of them, so it ought to be safe. His nod seemed to be answer enough as Ollivander gave him a light push in the direction of the train, and Harry scrambled aboard, Sirius jumping up behind him before ducking into the empty compartment he had put his luggage in a moment before. He looked out of the window and waved to Ollivander, a lump rising in his throat as he watched the other children all being hugged and kissed by teary-eyed parents. His pa should have been able to be there to see him off, being able to hug him and say goodbye to him in public without being at risk, and he felt jealousy stir in his gut, the type he hadn't felt since he had been rescued from his aunt and uncles. It wasn't fair. Why did his paw have to hide? Why did it have to be his paw that was on the run from the ministry? It might have been selfish, but he wanted to have been standing on that platform being fussed over by his paw. His jealousy spiked as he saw a boy jerk angrily away from his mother, saying something that Harry couldn't hear. That boy had precisely what Harry longed for, and he was just throwing it aside like it didn't matter. A furry head nudged his leg, and distracted Harry looked down to come face to face with a pair of gray eyes as he felt the concern and love he had unconsciously been blocking from his thoughts come sweeping down the bond. His jealousy evaporated as he wrapped his arms round the dog and buried his face in its fur. His paw might not have been able to show him off from the platform, but he was here with him now, and he'd be with him all year. He stayed there until he felt the train jerk into motion beneath him as the high-pitched whistle blew. Startled, he looked up, and a little reluctantly he unwound his arms from where he was clinging onto the Grimm's fur, although one hand still gripped the dog's fur tightly. He settled himself on the seat, shifting until he was comfortable, his eyes gazing out of the window as London flashed by. Harry felt rather than saw the black dog press up against his legs, the heavy weight of Sirius's tail comforting against his feet, and the warm furry body soothing his nerves even as his fingers twined deeper into the fur. It was becoming harder to feel anxious as the houses sped by. Harry could begin to feel the excitement rise up in him once more. He was going to Hogwarts, the place he had heard so many stories about, and where he'd be able to make friends that he didn't have to hide his magic from and learn the magic that Sirius's hadn't been able to teach him. For the first time since he had left Potter Manor that morning, Harry smiled, and he felt his paw contentment and love flood across the bond in response to that happiness. A knock on the door jolted him out of his thoughts, and he glanced up to see a small, slightly chubby boy with light brown hair looking at him nervously. "Do you mind if I sit here?" he asked timidly. Harry shook his head. "As long as you don't mind, Bardolph, you're welcome to," he replied, slightly wary of the reactions he had already seen when it came to Bardolph, but still wanting to be able to make friends. An expression of relief crossed the boy's face, and he hurried in, dragging his trunk behind him, only to stop dead when he realized precisely what Bardolph was. "Aye, is that a Grimm?" he stuttered, his face pale as he stared at the dog. Harry's eyes followed his. "He won't hurt you," he reassured the boy, wanting to be accepted even though the fear of the Grimm existed. "He's my familiar, so even though he is a Grimm, he isn't an omen of death." He paused, then grinned at the shy boy. "Well, he's been with me for 5 years now, and I'm not dead yet." The joke achieved what the reassurance couldn't, and the smile he got in return was a little shaky, but Harry smiled when he saw the boy push his trunk under the seat and settle across from him, even though it was plain to see that he was still wary of Sirius. "I promise he won't hurt or kill you," he repeated. "He's the best dog in the world. He's looked after me ever since he found me, and he considers me to be his cub." A thump of Sirius's tail emphasized the words, and the boy relaxed as he saw Harry's complete ease around the Grimm, noting the way Sirius curled protectively around Harry's feet. "He's called Bardolph, right?" he asked quietly, but Harry was pleased to see that most of the fear had left his face. "Yeah, that's right, and I'm Harry. Neville," the boy responded, and the silence grew for a minute before Harry broke the silence. "Are you a first year too?" Neville nodded. "Yes, I didn't think I'd get in though. I didn't do much accidental magic." Harry shrugged. "I don't think accidental magic matters much. Everyone's different, and if you've got magic, you've got magic." That won a smile out of Neville, but it soon faded. "My family thought I was all muggle for ages. They were so pleased I got in that Uncle Algy gave me a toad. I had a frog once when I was little. I made a whole enclosure for it and everything, and I'd catch it and put it in there, but it would always escape. I did that for a whole summer, but it left in the autumn and never came back. But Bardolph found me that year, so I didn't mind." They both laughed, and Neville reached into his pocket and pulled out a large green toad. "Trevor always tries to escape, and when he does, it takes me ages to find him. I spent a whole week looking for him once, only to find him happily sitting in the mandrake bed in my greenhouse." The conversation drifted to herbology then, and Harry quickly discovered that although he had been studying herbology for years with his paw, that Neville knew far more about plants than he did, and it was obvious that Neville loved his greenhouse and spending time in there the same way Harry loved flying. The conversation flowed freely as Neville gradually overcame his shyness, the topic changing from Quidditch, and Neville's confession he'd never been allowed to fly to their families. The story they had come up with was simple and not too far from the truth, as they were both aware that Harry's identity wouldn't be able to remain secret for long. The muggle makeup on his scar would keep people guessing until the sorting at the latest, so they hadn't bothered to make up a convoluted story. Harry would tell people who asked that he had been raised by his uncle Patrick, who was his mother's cousin in the muggle world, but he had been aware of magic as he had had all his parents' old spell books and story books when growing up, and his uncle had been aware of magic and made sure Harry was aware of his heritage. It was the basic truth, wrapped in enough lies to prevent anyone realizing precisely who his uncle Patrick really was, and the beauty of it was that the story was close enough to the truth that it would be very difficult for Harry to slip up. He could talk about both the magical and muggle worlds without it appearing suspicious, and by sticking with as much truth as possible he wouldn't have to make up lies that would be too easy to get caught up in. To put it simply, he was safe provided he never stopped playing the role he had been playing since he was 6. The arrival of the trolley broke the conversation off, and Harry purchased a wide selection. Wizarding sweets and chocolate had always been a special treat when he was growing up due to the ban on magic in the house, apart from in special areas, and even over the last year it had been a treat, and his pa had given him 10 sickles for this precise purpose. Neville's eyes widened as Harry tipped the load of sweets onto the bench. "Dig in," Harry said, a chocolate frog already in his hand. Neville looked at him for a moment, assessing. Then, once he was sure Harry had meant the offer, he reached out and plucked a cauldron cake from the pile, thanking Harry as he did so. Harry just grinned back at him, happy that he had made his first friend in the wizarding world. He still wrote to his muggle friends, of course, but it was getting harder, and he was beginning to feel like they didn't quite know what to write anymore. Their feast was interrupted by a slightly timid knock on the compartment door. Both boys glanced up, Neville looking uncomfortable, his eyes straying to Harry, obviously asking him to take the lead. Harry shrugged, clambering to his feet. If they were knocking, it wasn't about to be any bad, he hoped. Nevertheless, Sirius was instantly at his side before Harry pulled the compartment door open to come face to face with a bushy-haired girl, obvious tear tracks on her face. "Would it be possible for me to sit in here, please?" she asked quietly. "Some older boys told me I wasn't welcome in my compartment any longer." There was a slight catch in her voice when she continued, "I'm Hermione Granger and I'm a Muggleborn. Are you going to tell me I am not fit to learn magic as well?" Her chin came up defiantly with the last sentence, and she stared at them, almost waiting for them to reject her. Harry's face hardened slightly, and he could feel his pa anger over the bond. It wasn't hard to guess what had happened, and having been taught about the recent history of the wizarding world, and learning what his mother had faced, he hated the pureblood bigotry. If it hadn't been there, Voldemort wouldn't have risen and nobody would have died. Not to mention, he hated bullies after his experience with his cousin, and whilst he wasn't the most outgoing of people, in fact he could be downright shy, especially around adults, he wouldn't turn away someone in trouble. "No, come in. I'm Harry and this is Neville. I'm guessing you've had an encounter with cavemen that think they're superior." Her eyes widened at the description, one of his pa favorites when describing pureblood supremacists, then her mouth twitched in amusement. "Are your parents wizards then?" They both nodded, and Hermione's eyes became excited. "What's it like growing up in the wizarding world? It must be so different. I know people don't have a clue when I say that my parents are dentists." She looked at them expectantly, and Harry just turned to Neville. "You'll have to ask Neville. I grew up in the Muggle world, though I knew about magic." Hermione just nodded and turned to Neville, completely undeterred, to continue questioning him. The boy's face was a little overwhelmed, but he was answering the questions as best he could before she fired off another one. As he watched, and occasionally chipped in a comment, Harry couldn't help wondering if she ever paused for breath. He was suddenly struck by the thought that this wasn't too different from his old primary school. The only difference was that he was learning magic instead of French and maths, and he would be able to make friends here just as easily as he had done in France. The next visitors to the compartment weren't nearly as welcome. "Oh look, it's the Mudblood, Squib and another Mudblood." Harry glanced up to see a bee-owned boy, accompanied by 2 larger boys that resembled nothing more than hired muscle, force their way into the compartment. His eyes narrowed and his reached for his wand. He was completely aware just how vile an insult that word was, and he could feel his pa anger and protectiveness bleed across the bond. He wasn't normally one to pick fights, but he wouldn't stand to see someone hurt another person, particularly when that person was defenseless and he knew martial arts and defensive spells. "Leave us alone," he said quietly. The bee-owned boy just sneered at him. "Don't talk that way to your betters, Mudblood. I'm Draco Malfoy and no Mudblood can tell me what to do. This is your last warning. Get out of this compartment before I hurt you." "With what?" the boy mocked. "The wand that you haven't been taught how to use yet. No mere Mudblood could take me down." Harry paused for a moment, wondering whether it would be better to use one of the spells his pa had taught him or if he should humiliate him by using karate to get rid of them. But before he could move, a low growling caught his attention and he glanced down to see the boys staring at Bardolph in horror, their faces white and their eyes wide with fear. "Aggg Grim," Malfoy managed to stutter out, pointing at the large black dog in terror, and Harry suddenly grinned. "Oh Draco, meet my familiar Bardolph." Pale silver eyes met his green ones incredulously before the boy turned and quickly left the compartment, his goons trailing after them. Harry sat down abruptly, the adrenaline that had surged through him during the confrontation vanishing swiftly. His pa had been right. Practice duels were completely different situations from when you were actually in a confrontation, even though no spells were actually cast. A detached part of his brain was aware of the comforting presence of a large dog pressing against his legs, even as his hand automatically buried itself in the Grimm's fur, but the greater part of his brain was focused on the fact that he hadn't got to Hogwarts yet and he already had an enemy. After Malfoy had left, the rest of the journey passed reasonably smoothly, although Harry found himself the one subject to an interrogation now, on familiars and Grimms in particular. He felt extremely grateful that Pa had taught him a huge deal about familiars and Grimms, combined with his own experiences as a Grimm cub, in anticipation of precisely this sort of interrogation, although he thought, smiling a little wryly, they had expected the interrogation to come from Dumbledore, not a first year. Harry had relaxed more as the journey progressed though. Both Neville and Hermione looked like they could become good friends, and he was relieved to know that he would be able to make friends in the magical world as well as in the Muggle one. Soon, though night had fallen, they had changed into their robes and the train was pulling onto the platform. Nerves crowded up in his stomach and Harry pressed himself closer to Bardolph, twisting his fingers securely into the dog's fur. He felt a wave of love flow across the bond and he managed to summon up a shaky smile in response, and he saw Hermione and Neville smile at him, though they too looked extremely nervous. For some odd reason that comforted Harry, but he still stayed as close as he could to the Grimm as he clambered off the train, and he noticed that both Neville and Hermione were also staying close to him and Bardolph, even as some of the older students hurried out of the way of the large Grimm and the three small first years crowded in beside him. "Furs years over here. Furs years over here." The speaker was a giant of a man holding a large lantern, and it was to him that Sirius led them, and Harry noticed that there were a large number of students already surrounding him, although several took a step back when they noticed Bardolph. Inwardly Harry sighed. It was going to be a long year if everyone kept flinching as soon as they saw Bardolph, but that thought vanished a moment later, to be replaced with butterflies when the man spoke. "Hello ye lot. I'm Hagrid, keeper o' the keys. Now ye all here, we'd besses be gettin' down tear the castle. If ye'd all follow me." The large man turned, a lantern swinging ponderously from his large hand, and the gaggle of first years followed him, although several were giving the Grimm and the three first years surrounding it a large berth. The path was narrow and in the darkness it was easy to trip over stones and roots. Harry found him clinging even more tightly to Bardolph as the large Grimm, with eyes adapted to seeing in the dark conditions, picked a path expertly down the slope and supported Harry whenever the boy stumbled. "Ye'll get ye furs sight o' Hogwarts in a moment." Harry heard Hagrid's voice boom out, and in the next second they turned a corner and Harry gasped as Hogwarts came into view. His pa had described it several times, but Harry felt a sense of awe and wonder grip him as he took in the castle for the first time. He could see why Pa had said he could never describe it properly. He realized his mouth was open and he snapped it shut, glaring slightly at the Grimm when he felt the wave of amusement which slipped across the bond, but the glare vanished a second later when he caught the flash of pain and sadness hidden beneath it that he knew his pa was trying to hide. Frowning slightly, he pressed himself closer to the dog, though this time for Sirius's comfort and not his own, as his mind skipped back to what his pa had told him over a year ago when they had first reached Potter Manor. The forest gave way then to a lake shore, and Harry could see a fleet of boats drawn up on the sand, No more than 4 tear a boat, he heard Hagrid call as he hurried to one of the nearest boats. He scrambled in, grabbing at the side when Bardolph leapt in after him, setting the boat to rock him, and he grinned a bit nervously when Neville and Hermione clambered in after him. He saw them grin back, though Hermione's eyes were as wide as saucers as she stared out across the lake, but Harry knew his and Neville's weren't much better. He wasn't the only one to start when the boat suddenly began to move forward with nothing more than a command from Hagrid. He may have spent a lot of time around magic in the last year, but he had been raised primarily in the Muggle world, with magic just being something else that was around, so the possibilities of magic still caught him off guard. Soon the boat ride was over and Hagrid led them up several flights of stairs to a huge oak door which swung open to reveal a tall woman with a stern visage. "The Furs, years Professor." "Thank you, Hagrid." She turned and addressed the gathered crowd of first years, her eyebrows rising a fraction as her gaze landed on the small boy, his fringe smoothed down so the scar wasn't visible, who was standing next to the large Grim with his fingers entangled in the Grim's fur. She suppressed the shiver that wanted to rise along her spine at being in such close proximity to the creature, but she steeled herself and continued with her speech. Harry listened semi-attentively, but more of his attention was focused on relating the stern teacher in front of him with all the stories his pa had told him. He hadn't really believed everything Pa had said about Professor McGonagall, but looking at her now he could easily imagine her assigning awful detentions and being the strict head of house. It reinforced the idea that she wasn't a person to cross, and inwardly he made a mental promise never to get caught by her if he did pull a prank. A light jab to his ribs broke him out of his thoughts, and he realized that McGonagall had just finished talking about the sorting. She turned to him then, and he tried not to fidget under her stern gaze. "Mr. Potter," she said crisply, "after the feast you are to wait in the entrance hall and your head of house will collect you for the familiar bond check." She turned her eyes back to the mass of first years. "The sorting will commence momentarily. I suggest you all smarten up." With that she turned and strode through the double doors. They all heard the noisy babble of voices before the door swung shut, and immediately chatter broke out, and many looked over at Harry, their eyes wide and staring as they searched his face for his scar and tried to back away a little when they saw the Grim standing protectively by his side. Harry bit his lip as he saw his classmates edging away, nervousness prominent on many faces, and heard hurried explanations being given to the Muggleborns. He didn't want to be an outcast at Hogwarts like he had been on Privet Drive. He felt Bardolph lick his hand comfortingly and send a wave of love and reassurance across the bond. Harry smiled slightly, a little of his nervousness leaving him, and when Bardolph nudged him in the direction of Neville and Hermione he relaxed further, seeing that they were just as nervous as him and that neither of them were edging away from Bardolph. Rather, like him, they were finding comfort in the Grim's presence. "What did the professor mean, Harry?" Hermione whispered. "They have to make sure that Bardolph is really my familiar, so the headmaster has to cast a spell to prove that there is a bond there, otherwise Bardolph wouldn't be able to come." He told her, and he saw understanding dawn in her face. "How do they sort us?" she asked nervously. "I've practiced spells of course, but I'm not sure I'd be able to perform them under pressure. I wonder which ones we'll need." "I don't think we'll need spells," Harry said a little uncertainly, and he saw Neville relax a bit at his words. "I mean, a lot of us won't have done magic yet, and they can't really do the sorting on something we haven't been taught yet, can they?" It ended up sounding like a question, but he felt his paw send a wave of calm down the bond and he relaxed a little, although his nerves still jangled. McGonagall arrived then, and quickly the first years scrambled to get into a somewhat orderly line, the mutterings instantly cut off. Harry was relieved to see that Hermione and Neville stood close to him, and the presence of his paw at his side further soothed him as the door opened and they walked slowly into a large hall, crowded with students, the vast majority of whom were staring at the first years. Harry forced himself not to shrink into the Grim beside him. He didn't like the stares, and he had never liked attention, a leftover trait from the Dursleys where attention more often meant something bad, and he disliked this attention even more. Although he had his paw, he still harbored grief for his parents, and he would have traded all his fame in a heartbeat just to be able to meet them for a day and be able to remember it. He didn't want any of the fame or recognition, all he wanted for his paw to be free and for his parents to come back. But he knew they were dead and he would never see them again, but that didn't stop him from wishing. He felt a wave of love flow across the bond and he relaxed a little, his grief abating in the face of his paw love. His parents might be dead, but he had his pa, and his pa had given him so much and loved him so fiercely. He was everything Harry wanted in a parent, everything he could have asked for, and everything that he hadn't thought to ask for. The line of first years stopped as McGonagall stood by a hat on a stool, a large scroll in her hand. The waiting first years shifted as they looked round in wonder, staring at the obvious magic that was seeping from between the very stones of the castle and saturating the atmosphere from the stars overhead to the floating candles. Harry jumped when a rip opened in the hat's brim and suddenly a gravelly voice broke into song. Harry was hard-pressed to prevent his mouth from falling open as he was confronted with the spectacle of a hat singing about the 4 houses at Hogwarts. He had certainly seen some strange things ever since they had moved to Potter Manor, and living with his pa was an adventure because his pa did have a mischievous streak a mile wide and did everything to ensure that the magic lessons were memorable, so Harry had got used to being confronted with strange and weird objects when he was being taught, but none so crazy as a singing hat. His amazement didn't abate as McGonagall started to call out names and he realized that somehow this hat was sorting them and appeared to be able to read minds or something. That thought suddenly worried him. He had occlumency barriers up, of course, and the black air ring to protect his mind, but if the hat could get into his mind, it would find out about his pa, and then his pa would be taken away and hurt, and Harry couldn't allow that to happen. His fear spiked when his name was called, but he had to go forward as there was nowhere to run, and running would only expose his pa further, but that didn't stop the waves of nervousness from assaulting him as he perched on the stool, his fingers twisted tightly in Bartlef's fur, ignoring the whispers that had broken out as the hat dropped over his eyes. Immediately he pushed his shields up and strengthened them as much as he possibly could, but he had never been so uncomfortably aware of the fact his occlumency was lacking before. However, it was all for naught, and he felt a wave of pure panic assault him as a voice spoke in his mind, completely bypassing his shields. "Well, Mr. Potter, I have to say you're full of surprises." Harry scrabbled frantically at his occlumency shields, trying to push out a presence he couldn't feel. "Get out of my head," he thought determinedly, focusing all his power on trying to expel the invasion. "Not until I've sorted you, Mr. Potter," the hat replied, "and your occlumency will not keep me out either, although I am impressed one as young as you has such shields." "Please," Harry begged, "if you stay in my head, Pa will be danger and I can't let him be hurt." "Ah yes," the tone of the hat's thoughts almost sounded contemplative, "your Pa, and your weird sworn. I have to say it has been many years since such a bond has been seen within these walls, and I did not expect it to be the young Black, but then again he was the first in a very long time to go into Gryffindor." "Please don't tell anyone," Harry's thoughts were pleading. "They think he killed my parents and they'll hurt him if they catch him." "I am forbidden from revealing any information I discover from the students' minds," the hat said a little testily. "However, I can understand your fears. Now where to put you? Where to put you?" Harry bit his lip hard as the hat continued to muse. "You could fit in any of the houses. You were loyal, brave, cunning, and with a sharp mind. Now where to put you? You are loyal to those who you call family and friends, but that group is small and you do not trust easily, and while you are intelligent you do not love knowledge for knowledge's sake. Now that leaves just Gryffindor and Slytherin. You are cunning and you intend to do everything in your power to see Black freed, an impressive ambition, and more so in that it is not for yourself. However, you are brave and you have a courage that Gryffindor would have admired, as well as a large desire to see those you love safe. Now which to put you in? Which to put you in? Slytherin would see you great, with fame and glory, whilst in Gryffindor you would become a leader. Now where to put you?" "I'd like to be in Gryffindor, please, Mr. Hat," Harry thought. It felt a bit peculiar addressing a hat as Mr. Hat, but Harry thought it would be best if he was polite, seeing as this hat had the power to decide which house he would go into. "There is no need to call me Mr. Hat," came the answer, and the thought seemed vaguely amused. "My name is Alden, but why Gryffindor, Mr. Potter?" "Harry," he replied. If the hat was letting him use his proper name, it was only fair that Harry let him use his. "Pa and my parents were in Gryffindor," he explained slowly, "and Pa is the greatest person in the world. He's brave, loyal, clever, and most of all he loves me. I want to be like Pa when I'm older, and I'd prefer not to be in Slytherin because I don't want any more fame or glory. I'm already famous for living when my parents are dead and I hate it. Also, Voldemort was a Slytherin and I don't want to be like him." "The house you are sorted into does not define who you will become," the hat warned him, "but nevertheless fame is not something you can escape, Harry." "But I'll get more in Slytherin, you said," Harry said, "so please not Slytherin." Are you sure Slytherin would give you greatness and glory? Not Slytherin, not Slytherin, not Slytherin. Well, if you are certain, better be Gryffindor. The last word was yelled out for the whole hall to hear, and the storm of clapping that erupted from the colored and gold table took Harry from surprise. However, a grin rose on his face as he removed the hat from his head and walked down to the Gryffindor table. His grin widened as he slid into a seat between Neville and Hermione, relieved he was in the same house as his first two wizarding friends. He received relieved grins from them in return, and he felt a surge of pride rush across the bond. It was only now beginning to sink in. He was at Hogwarts and a Gryffindor. He knew his pa would have been proud of him no matter what house he had ended up in, but still he was happy to be in his parents' and pa old house. It had mattered to him, and feeling his pa pride had showed him further why. He wanted to be like his pa, and he wanted his pa to be proud of him, and it was certain that the latter was true. He stroked his fingers through the Grimm's fur almost absent-mindedly as the sorting continued. He wasn't quite sure how Sirius had managed it, but somehow the Grimm had managed to slip under the table without freaking out the students, and was now sitting at Harry's feet, his tail wrapped protectively around Harry's feet and his head emerging in the gap between the bench and the table. Several people were regarding the Grimm with no little apprehension, but thankfully the stares and whispered were diverted when Dumbledore stood. Harry's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the old man. While he was not directly to blame for Sirius's incarceration, that did not forgive him, in either of their eyes, for his actions since then. Not only had he been responsible for placing Harry at the Dursleys, it had been mainly his pursuit of them which had caused them the most grief over the years, with only Dumbledore's friends coming close to catching them, namely Moody, and from what the elves had said, it was Dumbledore who had been leading the search, so they had both built up a healthy dose of mistrust for the man. Sirius was more wary than Harry, but some of Sirius's fear and worry had rubbed off on Harry. Dumbledore was a dangerous enemy, and there was no doubt in either mind that he would attempt to prevent Harry from returning to Sirius in the holidays and summer, and for that reason neither were willing to trust him, or even attempt to, until he was completely aware of the situation and no longer trying to separate them. But at the moment they had no proof of Sirius's innocence to offer. Like the others, he clapped when Dumbledore finished speaking, but there was a reluctance in his movements and he stopped as soon as possible. He saw a couple of odd looks being thrown his way, especially from the older Gryffindors, but he ignored them as the food appeared, and he quickly filled his plate and dug in with relish, pausing only to fill a napkin with meat which he placed on the bench where Bardolph could reach it. Around him the other first years were relaxing as their leftover worry and nerves from the sorting drained away, and they tucked in happily. Soon conversation sprung up, and Harry found himself laughing and joking with his fellow first years as the feast progressed. Dumbledore was watching the Gryffindor first years attentively. He had been extremely relieved when Minerva had called the boy's name and he had come up to the sorting hat, because until he saw the child sitting on that stool he had not been completely certain whether Black would let the child come to Hogwarts or not. That relief had been matched when the hat had called out Gryffindor. Despite his fears, the boy did not appear to have been corrupted to the dark as yet, so perhaps there was still hope, although of course he wouldn't get a proper look until after the feast. He had seen the Grimm that accompanied the child, as well as the gazes being directed at it by a large portion of the student population, and he knew that he would have to do something to lay both the rumors and fears to rest, and a frown graced his features as he pondered how best to add it to his notices. However, he laid that train of thought aside as he reviewed how the beast was acting around the boy. He could see that the creature was protective of the child, and Harry in turn was attached to the Grimm. The way the child had held onto its fur throughout the sorting, and the way the creature pressed close to the boy and was wary, ready to respond to a threat, told him that much. He was in no doubt that anyone attempting to attack the child would be met with claws and teeth, and while he was pleased at the obvious loyalty of the creature and the love Harry seemed to have for it, its presence also raised questions. If Harry had such a loyal and protective familiar, did that mean the child was well treated by Black? He couldn't fathom Black being willing to accept a threat from an animal, even one bound to the child, and he knew the man who had betrayed Lily and James would have no qualms about killing such a creature, so the only reason that the Grimm was still alive must be that he had never seen a need to rise to his master's defense while in Black's company. That thought both reassured and frightened Dumbledore. It was reassuring to see that the boy was well treated, that he hadn't suffered again at the hands of guardians that would neglect and treat him badly, and that he had been provided for and cared for, perhaps not loved but at least looked after. But it worried him as well.
The hat had taken a long time to sort the boy, and he wondered now if that meant Harry was already on the path to turning dark, for surely the only way the child could have survived being raised, and perhaps even loved by Voldemort's right hand, would be if he could at least pretend to accept the man's teachings. However, there was hope. Harry was here, in Gryffindor, and from what Dumbledore could see, was already making friends with the Longbottom boy and a girl he knew was a Muggleborn. Perhaps it was not too late to turn the child from the dark path Black had placed him on, though make no mistake, he was going to be watching the child extremely closely. His last mistakes had led to the rise of Tom, and he would not see Harry too fall to the dark path like his godfather had done before him.
He nodded to himself, inwardly resolving not to fail. He would assess the boy when he came so that the familiar check could be performed, and he would then try to ascertain the easiest way to ensure the boy did not return to Black's care, although that could be postponed until the summer, as he had no intention of letting the child leave the castle until then, for regrettably there was no way a student could remain in the castle over the summer. Harry shifted from foot to foot as he waited for McGonagall to come and take him to the headmaster's office. He was nervous, although he was trying to hide it. Although he knew the bond was there, it wasn't a familiar bond, and although Pa had reassured him that Dumbledore couldn't tell the difference, he knew that he wouldn't fully relax until the test was over. He leant against the large Grim, yawning. It was late and he was tired and nervous and worried. He pressed up against the Grim, letting Bardolph take some of his weight as he opened the bond to its fullest and allowed his Pa emotions to wash through him, soothing him. The Grim's head came up and Harry felt Bardolph nuzzle him as if he was in his puppy form as a strong wave of love flowed through the bond. A smile rose on his face and he wrapped his arms around the Grim as he waited for the school to finish exiting the hall and for McGonagall to take him to Dumbledore to be tested. McGonagall entered the entrance hall no more than about 10 minutes later, and a smile tugged at the stern witch's visage as she took in the sight of the young boy and his familiar. At some point he had sat down and he was now leaning on the Grim, his arms wrapped around the dog as he waited. Certainly the beast did not look as fearsome now, as before her eyes it nuzzled the child as if Harry was its own cub. It reassured her that the Grim would not cause trouble once the students had got over their reactions, for it was obvious the creature was devoted to the child. She cleared her throat and Harry leapt to his feet, a slightly sheepish expression crossing his face as he turned to face her. Her breath caught for a moment as she realized just how much Harry resembled his father, although his eyes were clearly his mother's, and the way he was biting his lip reminded her of something that she couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, Professor," Harry said quietly, "I didn't notice you." A slight pink tint in his cheeks gave away his embarrassment. "As long as you don't make a habit of doing it in class, Mr. Potter, I can overlook it," she said crisply, although her lips twitched. "Now come along. It is already late and you have classes in the morning." Harry nodded and quickly followed, his eyes wide in wonder as they traveled through the castle corridors before eventually coming to a stop in front of the statue of a gargoyle. He looked at his head of house in confusion, but the confusion vanished as the witch said, "Cockroach clusters," and the gargoyle moved aside to reveal a narrow staircase. Quickly he strengthened his occlumency barriers. Pa had told him that they had thought the man could use legilimency, and he was not going to let the man discover about Pa. He was hard-pressed to stop his jaw from hitting the ground as he entered Dumbledore's office. Harry had never seen a place so obviously magical or eccentric in his entire life, from the phoenix on a golden perch to the myriad of devices that smoked and spun and whirled. The whole room just screamed wizard, and the type of wizard a Muggle would recognize, to him. Harry heard someone chuckle and he snapped his mouth shut, his eyes searching for the person until his eyes came to rest on the figure of his headmaster, who was peering over his half-moon spectacles at him. Instinctively he tensed slightly. Dumbledore's gaze was piercing, and with the secrets he had to keep he found himself fighting to stop himself from shrinking back. He felt like he was being X-rayed and he strengthened his defenses. He was not going to let down his Pa. "Hello there, Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes twinkling. "So this is your familiar?" Harry just nodded. "Bardolph," he said quietly, but the headmaster just smiled. "How long has he been with you, Harry?" 5 years, Harry replied, intending to give away as little information as possible. The less Dumbledore knew, the safer they would be, because he knew it was Dumbledore who had been leading the search for him. He saw the headmaster nod, and then the man's eyes flicked towards McGonagall, and Harry saw a brief flash of something in his eyes before Dumbledore took out his wand. "Very well," The bond should be quite well established then, so it should be easy to detect. Don't worry, the spell won't hurt. Harry nodded, keeping his eyes trained on the wand as he tightened his grip on the Grimm's fur, holding his wand securely in his other hand, ready to cast should Dumbledore cast anything but the revealing spell. Corgo copuli. The headmaster and an almost colorless jet of light flew from his wand and struck Harry square over the heart. Immediately a shining rope of gold materialized before their eyes, shining in the light of the office as it stretched from Harry's heart to Sirius's, thick and strong. A soft gasp escaped from Harry's lips as he looked at the bond for the first time. He knew that it was there, of course, and he knew that others could see it, but seeing it for the first time made a sense of majesty and awe rise in him. His pa had done this for him, had bound himself to him with this thick shining rope of gold, and it had been nothing but strengthened by his love. Hesitantly Harry reached out for it, but just before his fingertips touched it the rope dissolved as the spell wore away. He glanced up and saw similar expressions of shock and wonder on both McGonagall's and Dumbledore's faces. It was the headmaster who was the first to speak. There is certainly no doubt that a familiar bond is present. In fact, I have never seen such a strong one before, my boy. You have something special there. A smile lit Harry's face. I know, he replied, relief and happiness obvious in his voice, and he saw Dumbledore smile at him, like a grandfather would. Now I'm sure you are aware that some restrictions must be laid down. An unhappy expression grew on Harry's face, but Dumbledore ignored it as he continued to speak. While Bardolph will be allowed in classes, the teachers can request he leaves if he is being disruptive or if he is taking your attention away from your studies, and he must not harm another student or you will be punished. Furthermore, I do not want to hear of any destruction of property. Bardolph is your responsibility and you will be held responsible if he breaks the rules, although no curfew will be placed on him. Is that understood? Harry nodded. He won't break them, he said, but would I get in trouble if he defends me? It would depend on the situation, Dumbledore told him, but why would he defend you? Harry shuffled from foot to foot. He knew full well that if Pa thought he was in danger he would fight until the threat was destroyed or he was dead, but he didn't know how to describe it without giving away information. Eventually he had it. He thinks of me as his cub, he said softly, so he's very protective of me and will defend me if someone threatens me. I shouldn't be surprised. Harry heard the headmaster muse. It makes sense that a familiar would be extraordinarily protective of their master when they are so young. Harry had the feeling he wasn't supposed to have heard that. A suspicion solidified when the man turned to him. Understandable, my boy, but you should not be threatened here. Now it is late and I'm sure you want to be in bed. Professor McGonagall will show you to the Gryffindor common room now. Off you trot. Harry hesitated, his eyes sliding towards his head of house, but McGonagall merely beckoned him. Come along, Mr. Potter, she said crisply, and with one last look back at the office Harry followed her out of the office and up to the dorms he would stay in for the next 7 years. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.